Next, the secretaries of the U.S. military's armed forces testify on the President's 2019 budget request for their branches. Issues addressed include force readiness, equipment modernization, cybersecurity, and nuclear security strategy. We'll hear from Army Secretary Mark Esper, Navy Secretary Richard Spencer, and Air Force Secretary Heather Wilson. It's 2 hours and 40 minutes.
Committee will come to order. Today, the committee will hear testimony from the three service secretaries on the administration's fiscal year 2019 budget request, as well as on their progress in implementing the acquisition reforms already passed into law. The two are closely tied because both branches of government have a responsibility to get more defense value for the taxpayers from the money that's spent, as well as a responsibility to get innovation into the hands of the warfighter faster. Acquisition reform has put more authority and more responsibility with the services. We have begun to reverse the decline in funding. Now DoD and the services have to deliver results. The budget agreement, which Congress must complete by passing the appropriations bill this week, begins to repair and rebuild the military. But our adversaries are not waiting around for us to catch up. We must reform as we rebuild. We must be prepared across the full spectrum of modern warfare, from nuclear deterrence to the kind of political and information campaigns we'll discuss at greater length in our hearing tomorrow. And we must measure success by output and results rather than inputs and process. The budget agreement gives us an opportunity, but the legislative and executive must work together to make the most of it. Business as usual will not adequately defend the nation in today's world. I know I speak for all my colleagues on this committee in saying that we stand ready to do our part to get us on the right track. Yield to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. And I appreciate all the secretaries being here. And I agree completely with the Chairman's opening remarks. I think he perfectly outlines the challenge. There is the tiny little hurdle of actually passing those appropriations bills, which seems to always be like we're just around the corner from doing it. That's been going on now for 14 months, and it's still going on even as we're 3 days away from when it has to be done. But let's assume for the moment we get that done, then there is a reasonable amount of money available to the Pentagon for 2018 and 2019. And this is an enormously important opportunity for two reasons. Number one, because it is three actually. There is a lot of money there. So we have to make sure that we spend it wisely, as the Chairman said. Number two, we face an incredibly complex threat environment. So we're going to want to do like 5 million things at once, and prioritizing is going to be enormously important. And number three, that money is very quickly going to be gone, because when you look at our fiscal situation as we push towards $22 trillion in debt, we have, I think the guess is it's going to be about $1 trillion deficit this year. And of course, the Budget Control Act does have 2 more years, 2020 and 2021, to come back into place. You never know, but the odds are this is the largest the defense budget's going to be for probably about the next decade. So we have to make sure that we spend this money wisely, and we also spend in a way that doesn't lock us into sort of long-term obligations that can't be met given the fiscal restraints that are coming. But I think the most exciting and most promising aspect of this is I've met and worked with all three of you, and also the Secretary of Defense, the Deputy Secretary, and the Acquisitions Undersecretary, and I think we have a great team together that is really focused on efficiency and is really focused on getting the most out of the money we spend and trying to make the mother of all bureaucracies, which is the Pentagon, work. Just had a good conversation with Secretary Spencer about this. I think we're headed in the right direction. I'll just close by saying, as we head into the 2018 NDAA, if there's anything that we can do or not do in the NDAA to help you with that acquisition reform process, please let us know, because I think that's what's going to be most important, is to make sure that we spend the money as wisely as is humanly possible to meet all the challenges that we do face. With that, I yield back and look forward to testimony.
Committee is pleased to welcome the Honorable Mark Esper, Secretary of the Army, the Honorable Richard Spencer, Secretary of the Navy, the Honorable Heather Wilson, Secretary of the Air Force, as witnesses today. Without objection, your full written statements will all be made part of the record, and we will be interested in hearing any oral comments you'd like to make at this time. Secretary Esper, we'll start with you.
Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, distinguished members of the committee, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. Let me say up front that the Army's readiness across its formations is improving, and if called upon today, I am confident we would prevail in any conflict. This is due in part to the increased funding Congress provided last year. For this, I would like to say thank you. The Army's mission to defend the nation has not changed, but the strategic environment has. Following 17 years of sustained combat, we now face a future characterized by the reemergence of great power competition and the continued challenges posed by rogue states and non-state actors, making the world ever more complex and dangerous. To address these challenges, the Army is changing. We have a comprehensive plan to ensure our long-term dominance, but we must have predictable, adequate, sustained, and timely funding. Fiscal uncertainty has done a great deal to erode our readiness and hamper our ability to modernize. While the Army must be ready to deploy, fight, and win anytime, anywhere, against any adversary, the National Defense Strategy has identified China and Russia as the principal competitors against which we must build sufficient capacity and capabilities. Both countries are taking a more aggressive role on the world stage and either possess or are building advanced capabilities that are specifically designed to reverse the tactical overmatch we have enjoyed for decades. In support of the NDS, the Army is increasing our lethality along three focused priorities: readiness, modernization, and reform. Readiness is the top priority because only a ready total Army, regular Army, Guard, and Reserve, can deter conflict, defeat enemies, and enable the joint force to win decisively. We are refocusing training for our soldiers to be more lethal and more resilient on the high-intensity battlefield of the future. We are increasing home station training, getting more repetitions for our formations at the company level and below. We are giving training time back to commanders by reducing certain self-imposed mandatory training requirements not tied to increased lethality and by eliminating excessive reporting. We have maximized the number of combat training center rotations to 20 per year, 4 of which are dedicated to the reserve component. These rotations are focused on the high-end fight, replicating near-peer competitor capabilities, including increased enemy lethality, degraded communications, persistent observation, and a contested environment. And while the quality, training, and esprit of our soldiers are what make the U.S. Army the most ready and lethal ground combat force in history, our superiority is enabled by the best weapons and equipment we can provide. As such, my second priority is modernization, or future readiness. To ensure our soldiers never enter a fair fight, the Army is now increasing its investments in modernizing the force. Our modernization strategy is focused on one goal: make soldiers and units far more lethal and effective than any other adversary. The establishment of the Army Futures Command this summer is the best example of our commitment to the future lethality of the force.
And now live to
Army Futures Command will address the key shortcomings of the current acquisition system, providing unity of command, effort, and purpose to the modernization process. The Army has also identified its top 6 modernization priorities for the coming years. Each of these priorities is detailed in my written statement, and each is the purview of a newly established cross-functional team. The purpose of these CFTs is to determine the requirements of needed capabilities to ensure all stakeholders are at the table from day one and to focus Army resources on accelerated experimentation, prototyping, and fielding. In order to ensure battlefield success, our doctrine must be updated to reflect the threat environment we face and remain apace with our other efforts to modernize our equipment. My third priority is reform, freeing up time, money, and manpower to enhance readiness, accelerate modernization, and ensure the efficient use of the resources provided to us by the American people. Our reform efforts, particularly within the acquisition system, are long overdue. While Futures Command is probably the boldest reform we are pursuing, other reform initiatives owe much to the acquisition authorities delegated to the services in prior NDAAs. Within these authorities, we are reinvigorating the Army Requirements Oversight Council, moving major defense acquisition programs back to the service, and using other transactional authorities to accelerate fielding in limited situations. A ready and modernized Army is critical to defend the nation, but we must not overlook what makes us remarkable. For this, I've outlined 3 enduring priorities. First, taking care of our soldiers, civilians, and their families. Second, a service-wide recommitment to the Army's values, especially by leaders, to treat everyone with dignity and respect. And finally, strengthening our alliances and partners by building stronger ties through a number of initiatives. I look forward to discussing these with you as time permits. With that, let me thank you again for this committee's continued support of the Army, and specifically the defense authorizations and funding increases requested in the FY18 and 19 budgets. I look forward to your questions and appreciate the opportunity to discuss these important matters with you today. Thank you.
Secretary Spencer.
Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, distinguished members, I want to thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today and give you the posture of the Department of the Navy. It's an honor to sit here before you with my fellow service secretaries. On behalf of our services, the Navy Marine Corps team, thank you for the effort put forth by Congress in reaching a bipartisan agreement and then support by the authorizing committees. Let me tell you on behalf of the Navy Marine Corps team, we understand that this put people in the farthest edges of their comfort zone, and we are wildly supportive of that, and we thank you for your efforts. We look forward to getting those resources as soon as possible in order to enhance readiness and lethality in our department. These resources will be expended in focused alignment with the National Defense Strategy, building our combat credible force. I echo what Secretary Esper just said about the need for a steady state of resourcing. Today, 94,000 sailors and Marines are forward deployed and stationed using the global maritime commons as a medium for maneuver, ensuring the maritime lanes of commerce remain free and open, assuring access to overseas regions, defending key interests in those areas, protecting United States citizens abroad, preventing adversaries from leveraging the world's oceans against us 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Our budget requests enhance readiness and continue increasing the capability and capacity of the Navy Marine Corps team. As directed in the 2018 National Defense Strategy, our budget submission supports building a more lethal, resilient, and agile force able to deter and defeat aggression by peer competitors and other adversaries in all domains across the conflict spectrum. My priorities for the department center on 3 categories: people, capabilities, and processes. The ability to accomplish our mission relies on people. 800,000 sailors, Marines, active duty, reserve, our civilian teammates, and all their families. We're building a more lethal and resilient, agile, talented, and rapidly innovating workforce as we speak. The ability to accomplish our mission relies on having capabilities necessary to fight tonight, challenge the competitors, deter our rivals, and win. We are investing in the modernization of key capabilities and new technologies to attain that goal. Lastly, the ability to accomplish our mission relies on having efficient processes in place that will speed the value and the ability to support our warfighters in a more effective and efficient manner. We are creating a continuous improvement mindset in both our culture, management systems, in order to deliver performance with affordability and speed. I deliver to you today a plan for the Department of the Navy with a sense of urgency. We cannot and will not allow our competitive advantage to erode. With your guidance, these planned investments will provide combat-credible maritime forces for the future. We will ensure we're good stewards of providing these resources, drive efficiency across the department to maximize every dollar, and invest smartly to leverage the return on our investments. I look forward to your questions.
Secretary Wilson.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Smith, my statement is in the record, and I'd just like to highlight a couple of points that's really part of our budget. The first is that the Air Force budget for fiscal year 19 aligns with the National Defense Strategy. It recognizes that we face a more competitive and dangerous international security environment than we have seen in decades. It also recognizes that great power competition has reemerged as the central challenge to U.S. security. In our budget, there really are two bold moves and one continuing theme. The first bold move is the acceleration of defendable space. We need to be able to deter, defend, and prevail against anyone who seeks to deny our ability to freely operate in space. The President's budget reflects an 18% increase over the fiscal year defense plan for 19, the 5-year defense plan. And that is on top of a 6% increase that we presented in the fiscal year 18 defense plan. So accelerate defendable space. The second bold move in this budget is the shift to multi-domain operations. And that's most visible in the changing the way the Air Force plans to do command and control. There is one continuing effort in our budget, and that is to keep improving readiness to win any fight, any time. That's what you expect of your Air Force, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you all. I want to ask each of you to respond to what will be two questions, but I'd invite you to be brief because obviously there's a lot of members who want to have a conversation with you. As Ranking Member pointed out, we're talking about 19, but we have not yet completed all of the work for 18. We have a defense authorization bill signed into law. We have a budget cap agreement signed into law. This week, we need to pass an appropriation bill to match that. I would invite each of you to just briefly describe why this appropriation is significant for your service compared to a CR, compared to a sequestration level, compared to the President's original budget, whatever level you'd want to say. But I think it's important for members to hear from you directly now. Why is this vote this week important? Secretary Esper?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just say briefly, with regard to modernization, what we call future readiness, as you know, there are restrictions under a CR that limit us from doing two things: new starts and increasing the quantities of munitions, among other things. So those are two immediate impacts we face right now with regard to materiel and, again, preparing for conflict. More broadly, because of the fact that we're operating under the CR, and we have been now for nearly 6 months, it limits our ability to fund training exercises, to fill seats at our training base, and has an overall impact on the training and readiness of the force.
Secretary Spencer.
Mr. Chairman, I can only echo what Secretary Esper just said and add something on as far as the Navy is concerned. You've heard me speak before what CR has cost the United States Navy since they began, about $4 billion burned in a trash can. But more importantly, we desperately need this new appropriations bill to be set forward. The capital assets and our cycling of maintenance for aviation, surface warfare, undersurface warfare, it is critical, absolutely critical, that we get a continuous form of funding in order to manage the industrial base to put us back on a footing to be out there on the seas protecting that we should do.
Secretary Wilson.
Mr. Chairman, first, with respect to sequester, the sequester in the Budget Control Act is still the law of the land. And I would say that sequester did more damage to the United States Air Force and our ability to defend the nation than anything our adversaries have done in the last 10 years. We did it to ourselves. We cut 30,000 people out of the Air Force, reduced by 10 fighter squadrons, and weapon system sustainment, and the problems that we're having with pilot retention can really be tied directly back to sequester several years ago. With respect to the continuing resolution, we're limited in we can't have any new starts of programs. So a lot of the programs that are going to take us into the future are just still pending, and we will have to execute those in the last 6 months of the year. Particularly with respect to readiness, one of our major readiness issues is munition stockpiles. We want to be able to expand the capacity of our munitions production, and we can't do that until we get through, get this budget through this week. Thank you.
One other brief question. This committee has helped enact significant acquisition reform for the last 3 years. A lot of that puts more responsibility on y'all's shoulders. My question is, based on what you know now, is there any area where we really messed up, where we made a mistake, where we did something that goes the wrong direction and need to be corrected? Obviously, there's going to be tweaks and small challenges, but based on what you've seen and the decisions you've had to make, et cetera, have we gotten anything significant wrong in the last 3 years? Secretary Esper?
Mr. Chairman, no, not that I've encountered yet. In fact, everything that I've had to deal with in the 3+ months that I've been on the job has been positive.
Mr. Chairman, I would say the same. There's some fascinating and interesting tools that we're using and we are going to use and look forward to use. So thank you for those. I would ask for a stabilization period so we can digest what we have and have the ability to come back to you if we need more. But right now, the knife drawer looks full.
Secretary Wilson.
Mr. Chairman, there's several things we're taking advantage of. The other transaction authorities, prototyping and experimentation are tremendously valuable, as is the decision by the Congress to push down to lower levels of authority, milestone decision authority. There are a few other things that I would say are strings attached that I think might be worth looking at. There's a provision in there called Provision 807 on costing and fielding estimates that may require to go all the way up to the Secretary of Defense for every major acquisition program. That probably should be put with the milestone decision authority. There's an independent technical readiness assessment that also may have to go back up the chain. All of these, if you push authority down but you still require some of the sub-decisions to go all the way back up the chain, may not result in the speed that you really want. And then there's another provision, 808, which has to do with an acquisition scorecard, which is a similar kind of issue. So I would say, in general, these are tremendously helpful. We are accelerating our use of them, but there are a few things that we need to make sure the details also get pushed back to the milestone decision authority.
Well, I'd just say we want to work with you on in identifying those items, but as I mentioned at the beginning, a major premise of this reform is to give more authority and also more responsibility to the services. That's on y'all's shoulders. And as y'all well know, the world is moving so fast and in many ways is so complex and dangerous that we can't afford to not take full advantage of those tools, but also move out much quicker than we have been. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was joking with staff up here that I think what we all ought to do is the only question we should ask throughout this entire hearing is we should ask Secretary Wilson to tell us what she thinks about the Space Corps, and we should just have a constant conversation about that, because I think that'd be interesting. I'll leave that to Mr. Rogers and Mr. Cooper, actually. But the question I do want to ask is where can you save money? Because I've often said that ever since I've been on this committee, 21 years, it has a very easy to track theme, and that is people come over from the Pentagon and tell us all kinds of horror stories about what they don't have, about how short they are, about their unfunded requirements, about all the money that they need that they don't have, and how that lack of money is going to lead to one cataclysm after another. And I don't discount the threat environment that the chairman just described, but if we're going to get to good on that stuff, it can't all be up, 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 up. There's got to be some place in a $700 billion budget where you're going, gosh, you know, I wish I didn't have to spend that money because I'd like to spend it over here. So I realize that the odds of you guys actually answering this question are remote, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. If you would say, you know, whether it's a program, personnel, whatever, you know, where can you save money in each of your services? Where are we spending money that we shouldn't be spending money?
So, Mr. Smith, I'll go first. I think there are three things that come to mind immediately. First and foremost is acquisition and acquisition reform. So we believe that as we stand up Futures Command and the structure, the processes, the culture that we hope to change alongside that will result in fewer dollars wasted going forward and actually maybe save dollars as well. Number two, we are looking at a number of initiatives to tackle that problem as well. So, for example, the problem of savings. One is contracting services. So we're looking to maybe save $1 billion plus a year for a period of years just by consolidating and rationalizing our contracting services.
Are you sure? I mean, that, as you well know, that's a battle that is very, very difficult. Because
yes, sir. These are all difficult.
Do you have any sort of quick metric for when it makes sense to contract out and when it doesn't?
Well, I'm speaking more directly now to services like that you may find on a garrison or a post, where maybe you have dozens of contracts, all for a small amount of money.
Okay. Where
you might be able to consolidate those. You can reduce the throughput going through your contracting command to handle those, and you can find some efficiencies there.
Okay.
You're speaking to a different issue, which I also agree we can find, and that is contractors. So I think to the degree which, and this gets to the third point, to the degree which we can, and I'm looking at this now, right-size our headquarters, rationalize them in terms of their functions, and much like the Congress has done with pushing authorities from DOD down to the services, how much authority and responsibilities can we push down to lower-level commands, and maybe, again, save some manpower and resources that we could push back into other priorities or back into the field to make sure we have our forces are fully fleshed out.
Are there any programs that, tanks, weapon systems, anything like that you think we're forcing on you that probably isn't necessary?
We are looking at the entire range of 800-plus programs we have. I think as part of our, I know that as part of our reform efforts, we are probably going to look at the lower end of that and assess each for return on investment and probably postpone or cancel some programs.
Okay. Mr. Spencer?
Congressman Smith, I'd start by saying process, which is one of my areas that we're highlighting on. And I can address some of the things we're doing inside the Department of the Navy right now, where we found close to $600 million just in de-obligation. So changing the thought process and changing the attitude on how we actually contract. So when you're through with a contract, your work's not done. If, in fact, there's funds left over, put them back in the bin. Don't send to the Treasury. Small moves like that are now starting to save us some big monies going forward. So focus on process across the way. Acquisition is the other big lever because that's where all the dollars are. If you look at the Navy, we have Ford-class, Virginia Payload, Columbia, H-53. Those are some very sizable programs. Two things that we need to address there. In the long term, we need to keep consistency of people involved with these platforms. They're long-term, long-lead platforms. We need to keep the expertise in place rather than removing people and causing seams in information. More importantly, the acquisition process, once the contract is laid, it certainly isn't on autopilot. It deserves the attention up and down senior management at all times to manage these programs. You'll see it, I think, going forward with Ford. We have a new plan here. You heard we put out the two-ship buy. This was divined from conversations that started back in November with our supplier. And I'd almost like to say it's a new world in that the way we're approaching this. And it's a hands-on, very active management style.
Thank you.
Sir, I'd identify a couple of things. One is the cost of sustainment, which for us is where a lot of the cost is for aircraft. And let me give you a couple of examples. Additive manufacturing as a substitute for very long supply chains, and that'll require some help from you all with respect to intellectual property, and other things like predictive maintenance, so that we can actually drive down drive up the ability to have aircraft available and overall reduce the sustain. We're going to focus a lot on sustainment costs and what we can do to improve our sustainment cost performance. The second area I identify would be artificial intelligence tools for intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, analysis. Right now we have a lot of intelligence analysis, a lot of people watching full motion video. That's not a good use of money or time, and in that case, time is money.
If I may just say, on that point just quickly, there's a lot of technology out there and software that is getting frighteningly better at being able to look through a massive amount of data and find what you're looking for, so that people don't have to, sit there and look at video after video. I mean, we have so much information, there's no way you could possibly see it all. What we need is the AI to get in there and find what we're looking for in that massive database. So that's technology I'd really encourage our committee to pursue. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. In fact, we are working several projects along that realm. The third that I'd highlight has to do with the way in which we're doing acquisition. And we just released a report on acquisition that includes a number of initiatives to systematically reduce the cost of what we're acquiring, including things like better estimates of what something should cost, so that we drive down the cost of things in negotiation with contractors. We have over 450 very large acquisition programs, and when we do those things systematically and we invest in our workforce, we're doing the contracting, we can over time drive down cost, and some of that's included here. I would also say finally that the speed of acquisition, in the case of acquisition and manufacturing, time is money, and so increasing the speed also helps to drive down the cost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Wilson's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your success with Speaker Paul Ryan for appropriations to fund the military. Thank you for your leadership. I want to thank each of you for being here today. Your service as a grateful veteran myself who has sons and a nephew serving today in the Army, Navy, and Air Force. We join service. Your leadership is reassuring to military families. Over the years, I've had the opportunity and been inspired to visit our Bulgarian and American troops at Novo Selo. Last year, it was incredible to meet with our NATO troops in Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, and the Republic of Georgia. I want to commend you that I think it's highly appropriate. The state partnership program is the state of Georgia with the Republic of Georgia. It's a wonderful experience to see so many Georgians together. What is the long-term vision for America's presence in Europe? What is the right balance between rotational and permanent troop presence in Europe?
Well, thank you, first of all, for that comment on the state partnership program, Mr. Wilson. I agree it's a very important program. When I was in Europe recently, I had just witnessed the Illinois Guard coming out of Poland. They've had a relationship together since 1993, and then I had the privilege of traveling to Ukraine, where I saw the New York National Guard training our Ukrainian partners there. And as a former guardsman myself, I really appreciate the work that our Guard units are doing around the country. With regard to your question, that is an issue that the Army is looking closely at on a constant basis. When I was in Europe, I had a chance to talk with the EUCOM commander, General Scaparrotti, about this. Right now, there's great benefit to rotating an Armored Brigade combat team to Europe. It provides us the ability to send a highly trained, fresh out of National Training Center, ready force that is then also trained to deploy onto the European continent. That is something critical as we find a large number of our forces here in the United States, the need to train to deploy. At the same time, we are also, as part of this FY19 budget, building pre-positioned stocks, an additional set in Europe to fall in. And I think over time, depending on how we are able to build additional facilities, particularly the poles, to maintain readiness, whether it's gunnery or maneuver, it starts changing the equation as to how much we would rotate and how much we would permanently station on the continent.
Well, I greatly appreciate, because to me, it's peace through strength, and to block Russian aggression in Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine. And for each of you, in line with Ranking Member Smith, how are you planning to address the emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, high-performance computing, directed energy, hypersonics, and autonomy? How are you resourcing these technologies within your budget request? And each of you, hey, we'll begin with Secretary Spencer.
Congressman Olson, thank you. If you look at the National Defense Strategy and you look at the key implementation levers when it comes to technology, the majority of them are the ones that you just mentioned. We are realigning dollars spent in our $18 billion research, development, testing budget to align with the National Defense Strategy in order to not only capture more dollars into those buckets, but to enhance the studies and the research that we've been doing so we can not only apply it, but get it out into the warfighter's hand as soon as possible.
Sir, with respect to hypersonics, the Air Force budget includes $258 million for fiscal year 19 for hypersonics. For directed energy, it's $280 million. What I would also say is that the three of us as secretaries have been getting together frequently to have breakfast. The Navy has the better coffee, but one of the things that we're doing is identifying high priority areas of research, and what all three of us are doing in those research areas, our services are doing in those research areas, to see where there are gaps gaps, where there are overlaps, and where we can build off of each other's research, including testing Navy systems on Air Force systems, and I think will start to bear fruit.
Well, it is true the Navy has better coffee. But we are also aligning our S&T for FY19 and 18. We have realigned 80% of our S&T funding along our 6 modernization priorities to make sure we get better bang for the buck, better ROI for those. Within that does include things such as AI, hypersonics, as Secretary Wilson mentioned, where we're trying to collaborate on that, and other areas such as directed energy, where we think collaborating together, putting additional funding into this can really help us get to the next level with regard to these types of technologies.
Well, thank each of you, and as the technologies change, I'm just grateful that you're in your leadership positions. Thank you.
Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's good to see all of you here. Thank you very much for your service, for all of your efforts right now as we go into this difficult period waiting for budgets and appropriations. And I want to applaud you on many of the points you've already made, but I wanted to talk to you about one that I think is dear, at least to, I know, Secretary Wilson's heart, as well as a number of us here. Each of your memos discussed recruitment and retention, but none of you mentioned that to date, each of the military services experienced challenges retaining women to a varying degree, with a particularly wide gender gap in operational specialties. More women than men, as we know, leave the military at various career points. So concerns persist that this attrition will result in a disproportionate impact to mission readiness if left unresolved. What initiatives is each of your respective services implementing to address this gender gap? How are you evaluating that? And to what extent is there really a lot of good sharing that's going on between the services? Secretary Esper, you want to start?
Yes, ma'am. Let me address it a few different ways. First of all, I think we see a higher percentage of women being selected to enter the academy as from a commissioning source. Along those same lines, as you know, in the past couple of years, we've opened up the combat arms branches to women. They are doing very well. I've had the chance to visit with them, the units they're in both the National Training Center and at Fort Bragg. And at this point, under the Leaders First policy, we have dozens of women in, and in the battalions, these battalion-size units, over 600 women in. So a lot of expansion happening there. We're expanding the number of posts they can travel to as well, to make sure that we have greater opportunity throughout the ranks. I think there's a larger point here, too, and it's a more of a strategic one that I've discussed with some members here, and it's one of my major lines of effort in terms of the future Army, and that is how do we reform our current personnel system to focus it more on talent, an individual's knowledge, skills, and attributes with their preferences, so that you could allow, for example, if a woman wanted to time out her career and start a family, then could come back in and restart the clock without any type of promotion penalty or those types of things. So I think we need to relook, and I know we are internally. I've stood up a task force to look at what a future personnel system would look like to accommodate things such as you described, to accommodate greater gender integration and opportunity.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary?
Congresswoman, as it applies to the Navy, I would, again, it's almost getting repetitive, but echo what Secretary Esper just said as far as what we have for options and the ability to entice women to come in and join the Navy. All service sectors are open in both the Navy and Marine Corps, as you know. All specialties are open. But when it comes to retention, if you look at our efforts in Sailor 2025, what we're doing specifically in the Navy, the ability to have an off-ramp mid-career to go do whatever you'd like to do, whether that's to go off and get a degree or go off, start a family, go off and do whatever you'd like to do and come in without penalty. That has been an active program that we've had, quite successful, and we're quite pleased with the results that it has. Going forward, rest assured the Navy is really looking at this. It's game on, because all three of us fish from the same pool, and that pool is getting smaller and smaller, both by qualification and by demographic size. We are going to be competing with the private sector. As the economy increases, we're going to see more competition there. We're going to use every single tool available to us, and I do believe we probably will be in front of you in the future, whether it's addressing DOPMA or something along that lines, to allow us more flexibility in order to incorporate those good people.
Thank you.
Ma'am, we have a higher percentage of women in the service than any of the other services, and every position in the Air Force is open to women. We are also looking at different ways to be more flexible about how women and men can come in and out of the service, depending on their life circumstances. I would also echo my colleague's comment. I think this year we are expecting a higher percentage of women entrants into the this service academy class than any in history. And I would also say that we're, I think, trying to change a little bit the way we talk and think about who the protectors are in this country. Because I think sometimes the way in which we talk about the services may appeal more to boys than to girls. And that's important in the way we talk about these things. And if I asked everyone in this room to think, just close your eyes for a second and think about the most protective person you know in your life, someone who would do anything to keep you safe. And half the people in this room are thinking about their moms. We are the protectors. That's what the military does. We serve to protect the rest of you. And that's a very natural place for a woman to be.
Time the gentlelady's expired. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here and for your service to our country. Secretary Wilson, first of all, I wholeheartedly agree with that last statement you just made, and I applaud your effort in that endeavor. One of the primary things I try to do on this committee is keep Ranking Member Smith happy, and since he's charged me with asking you about Space Corps, I guess I will.
So that's because he didn't want me to talk about the KC-46.
Yeah. President Trump last week endorsed the idea of a separate Space Force. Do you agree with the President's assertion that we should form a separate Space Force?
Last week, the President of the United States said that the new National Defense Strategy for space recognizes that space is a warfighting domain. I don't remember any president ever openly saying that. He has relaunched the National Space Council under the leadership of Vice President Pence, and nowhere is his leadership more clear than in the President's budget. And this year's budget accelerates our ability to deter and defend and protect our ability to operate and to win in space. The President wants to consider different ways of organizing, and we look forward to supporting him in that effort.
Great. And I would also point out his words were, we should have a Space Force, we will have a Space Force. I like the way that sounded. Last week, we had General Jay Raymond testify before my subcommittee, and he talked about space being a priority and an elevation of its priority status within the Air Force. Then he also talked about a $351 million worth of requirements that are unfunded requirements. If, in fact, space has this enhanced priority status within the Air Force, why are those $351 million worth of requirements unfunded?
Sir, first of all, I appreciate the increased top line that came from this committee and from the Congress as a whole. We are required by law to put forward an unfunded priorities list, and what we've done in our unfunded priorities list is to accelerate things that are already in our 5-year plan, so that when you ask us if there is higher top line, if there's more money available, what would we do with it? And the answer is we would accelerate what's already in our 5-year plan, and that was in 3 areas. The first was space, the second was nuclear modernization, and the third was military construction.
Well, in your opening statement, you made reference to the fact that there was an 18% increase over the FIDEP. But yet there was only a 6% increase proposed for the 19 budget. I would really like to see those numbers reversed, at least for the 19 budget. I think more than 6% would be a better illustration of priority status. Secretary Esper, my understanding is that the Army's modernization budget went up 14% from 18 to 19, and that's great news. And you've using that money to fund a variety of very important programs, but you forgot one. The Stryker program. Can you tell me why that is the case?
Mr. Rogers, we are actually putting money into the Stryker program based on a urgent operational needs request from the commander in Europe. What we are doing is improving their lethality and survivability. On the lethality front, we're looking at arming them with 30mm cannons and with anti-tank missiles. I will tell you that when I was in Germany a month and a half ago now, I had a chance to spend some time on the vehicle and talk to the crew and was very impressed by what I saw. They will be taking those vehicles through their trials over the coming months, and we will assess the effectiveness. I think in principle, I think it's very good where we're going with regard to both upgunning them and making them more survivable in the sense of adding double V hulls, for example.
What are your long-term plans for the Stryker, or do you know right now?
Well, right now we plan to keep them in the inventory. I think our focus really is on the next generation combat vehicle. That is one of our cross-functional teams, and that is viewed more as a replacement, the next generation for the Bradley fighting vehicle, if you will.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Larson.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for coming. So we've been hearing testimony in the committee and a couple of subcommittees specifically with regards to the investment in emerging technologies from other countries, China and Russia in particular, and how that could change a military balance of power. So the current S&T budget for the department as a percentage is, I think, lower than it was when I was first here in the early 2000s. It's right now it's about 2.3% of the total budget. So the question I have is if this is a concern and a high priority, the S&T budget does not seem to be reflecting that. So for each of you, briefly, can you tell us what your plans are for investing in your own S&T budget over the next 5 years as opposed to just today?
Yes, sir. Let me first say from 17 to 19, we're seeing nearly a 20% increase in terms of RDT&E funding, so about $8.5 billion to 10.2 or so. Alongside that, what we plan on doing is looking at the 80% of the S&T budget and making sure that is fully aligned with our priorities. What we found last fall going into this that they were not aligned to any particular priority. So I think we expect to get a lot more bang for the buck, return on investment, if you will, from greater alignment and greater focus. Knowing, of course, that S&T, the RDT&E budget is the seed corn for future readiness, we plan to continue investing in that because we know it's critical to achieve what we need to achieve in order to be able to meet the threats, the challenges that are outlined for us in the National Defense Strategy.
Spencer.
I'm actually not tremendously concerned as far as the overall S&T numbers because when you look at 17 compared to 19, we're up $1 billion in Navy research and development. From where I came from, the first thing I noticed is that we're going to have to really harness the discipline of portfolio management. The great thing about having a strategy is you do have alignment. In the NDS implementation, we have our 6 lanes of effort. We will focus our dollars on those 6 lanes of effort, not to the disregard of other projects that we might have going on, but it's going to be a more focused, tailored application of funds.
Sir, we had a slight increase from fiscal year 18 to fiscal year 19 in our S&T budget from 2.5 to 2.6 billion. I would say that my concern is that most of that is on the test and evaluation side and not on the path-breaking research side. The Air Force has launched a 12-month review of our science and technology strategy to look at both where we invest and then how we partner with universities and industry to get more out of our research dollar, and particularly how to spin on technology developments that may have been developed outside of national security to get them into our weapons systems.
Yeah, and that's probably where you ought to be headed. I appreciate the answers here. They're not settling for me, but I appreciate the answers. Secretary Spencer, I'll just ask you specifically on this because of time, but it has to do with EW and EW XCOM, Executive Committee. I have the Growlers are all stationed at NAS Whidbey Island, and of course they're just airplanes until you put a lot of good stuff on them, and that's all electronic warfare. But we've had problems in the past getting the Pentagon to focus on EW more broadly. Each services, Air Force dropped out of that business for a while, come back in. Army didn't have an organic capability until that was stood up in about 2006, 7, 8 or so because of Iraq. maybe not on behalf of all the services, but maybe just focusing on your service. Can you talk a little bit, help me understand what you're doing to support EWXCOM, not just in terms of ideas, but to get that acquisition process to move faster when we make that investment into electronic warfare, so that we have things like next-gen jammers, which are finally coming online after a lot of time. How can we shorten that time frame?
Congressman, that's it's a focus of what we're doing right now. As I said before, another committee, one of the secret weapons that took us 3 months to convince to come join us was Mr. Hondo Gertz out of SOCOM, and his abilities and his proven track record in expediting the acquisition process within government confines. That's going up and down the ladder on all platforms. EW is a key component for not only Navy Marine Corps team, but for our other fellow services on battle force management. So it is a key area that we are working on. It develops across the board. We're in conversations at all times. Again, back to your question, as it pertains specifically to the Navy, it is our focus. We will get the next-gen jammer out there ASAP.
Mr. Conway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Wilson, Secretary Wilson, I've never heard the case for who should be serving in our uniforms better put than the way you said that. I don't know if you noticed, but you got real quiet in here where you were finishing up your statement, and I think it's because your words were reverberating through the minds of everybody in here. So thank you for that statement, and I'm blessed to have been reared and raised by a mom who fit that category, so thank you for that. Secretary Spencer, we had 4 ships wrecks in 17. As a result, Vice Chief of the Naval Operations and the Secretary ordered a review of what was going on and why. One of the recommendations was that we take that decision as to putting a boat in harm's way further up the food chain and not allocating resources to a combatant commander that weren't ready to go there. Can you talk to us about where that recommendation is and what's been the reaction among the various folks who were looking at that?
Yes, Congressman, just to add a little meat on that, not only did we do a comprehensive review at the Secretary's, at the CNO's level, but we also put the strategic review in place at my level to go after the root causes. And one of the things that is, one of the items, the recommendations that came out of the strategic readiness review was our C2, our command and control. And you will soon be hearing a result of the last, I believe it was 2.5 months of deliberation we have in the Navy to provide a clear point of view from the commander on his ship looking up as to what resources he can ask for, who's responsible for providing them, and his chain of command to make it crystal clear that responsibilities are in place. As far as the combatant commanders go and tasking the demand signal, that is in place. I can tell you that robust conversations go on at all times. I think it's been heightened to a higher level. But interestingly enough, it is not so much the generator or the demand signal that's the issue. It really comes back to resource funding when it comes to surface ships and the Navy, and even subsurface ships and aviation for that matter. With continual funding, we can get these capital assets through maintenance back out into the fleet on a regular drumbeat, and that will be the biggest solution to providing readiness and troop wear going forward.
Thank you. Mr. Esper, Secretary Esper, the fight in Afghanistan, you're moving something called the Security Force Assistance Brigades, which seems to be a more tailored approach to assistance using maybe more experienced personnel as an idea, as a way to try to make sure the brigade combat teams are ready to go, but then looks like we're asking for those to come in on top of those security force brigades. Can you talk to us about the operational tempo of that security force brigade, and why that's even more or less than what it would be now, and the impact it has on your ability to keep folks ready to go?
Yes, sir. As you noted, we're standing up 6 security force assistance brigades, 5 an active component, 1 in the Guard. 1 has been stood up and is now in Afghanistan. It began in Fort Benning. The second one is being stood up now at Fort Bragg. And as you rightly noted, the purpose is to provide specially trained, ready, and equipped forces that can relieve infantry brigade combat teams of The challenge is maintaining readiness while they're deployed. So an infantry brigade combat team is 3,000 plus people. An SFAB is 816 or so. And what that does is you can allow better trained, equipped forces to train allied or partners at a much lower cost without degrading the readiness of a brigade combat team. So as we said, the 1st Brigade Combat Team, I'm sorry, 1st SFAB is on the ground now in Afghanistan, beginning operations, and we're anxious to see how well they do. And as you noted, there is an IBCT there currently. I think over time, the purpose is to replace and not have a dual capability on the ground.
So what would be the operational tempo for that security force brigade? How often will they go into the fight, coming and going?
I think it's would be on the same type of rotational basis. I don't know that we've determined whether it's a 6 or 9 month rotation. That's something I know the chief and the staff are considering. But again, the aim would be to replace an IBCT, and IBCTs are typically on a 9-month rotation.
So will they go back to the same spot, kind of like your Special Forces guys do, to make sure they've got familiarity with the area?
Yes, sir, depending on the need from the combatant commanders.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're back.
Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Spencer, in the last couple of weeks, our committee has heard from 2 combatant commanders, Admiral Harris, who testified that he's basically been able to get, for the 2nd year in a row, only about half the attack submarines that he needs in terms of requirements that he has. General Scaparrotti testified last week about the fact that they're seeing Russian submarine activity they haven't seen since the 1980s. In your testimony, you talked about the fact that the shipbuilding plan is designed to sort of be able to take advantage of industrial capacity to sort of move more aggressively, which is great. I guess the question I want to ask is the Block 5 process is underway right now for the next 5-year purchase of Virginia-class attack submarines. You know, we had a great model in 2014 where the Navy built into the contract an option to go higher than the 9 subs that was initially requested by the Navy at that point, and they were able to get, as Admiral Johnson proudly proclaimed, 10 subs for the price of 9, by using that option as a way to incentivize the 2 shipyards to come in with a better price, which is all about acquisition reform, obviously, that we're talking about here today. I have to say, we're getting sort of mixed signals right now in terms of, you know, on the one hand, your visual chart that came over with the shipbuilding plan showed capacity in 22 and 23. Obviously, the NDA last year, my friend Mr. Whitman and I, we sent a strong signal that we'd like to see that block go higher than 10 subs. Yet, what we were getting in terms of, you know, the narrative testimony from the Navy is that they are really just proceeding on a 2-a-year build rate for Block 5. So I guess the question I want to ask is, you know, using, again, a successful model, I mean, what's your position in terms of using an optional structure to the Block 5 contract to at least give us the ability to go higher, given, again, what we're hearing from the combatant commanders?
Thank you, Congressman. The whole purpose for the 30-year shipbuilding plan to be delivered alongside the budget was to open up an intellectual discussion about what is available out in the industry as far as capacity goes. And that was the whole reason we included the graphic. As you all well know, the 3 of us sitting here are portfolio managers when it comes to allocation of resources for specific platforms. Would I love to say I can take as much money as you will give me and I will provide you as much as I can up to industrial capacity? Yes, but then that would disbalance the portfolio. That being said, when it comes to the Virginia class, which, by the way, for any of those of you who are interested, it is probably one of our best performing undersea contracts, if not boat contracts that we've had over its period of time, as far as performance for dollar. Yes, we have that option available to us. Yes, we have the option available to us, and we've been talking to industry. Could we take that up to 3 boats a cycle? Yes. It's there if, in fact, the resources are there. It is the managing of the resources. If, in fact, through reformation, I can find another $2 billion within the Navy, and I can reapply those funds internally to that program or any other of the programs, totally available.
So, and that's good to hear. Again, I just want to emphasize that when the Block 4 was done, the resources actually weren't sort of appropriated yet. I mean, but it created a structure where they were able to expand it as time went on. Again, with the strong support of Congress. And I just, want to leave that point with you, that I think that hopefully will be the way to incentivize the shipyards, as well as to give us that option to go bigger. Because, and I know you know this. I mean, this is a real critical part of the fleet in terms of what's happening out there in the world today. And just to follow up on that, again, you were so helpful during the conference committee in terms of getting that continuous production authority, which again was another way to give the Navy some efficiencies on Columbia class. Again, the October report that came over really didn't talk about using those authorities in 2019, and that's about $380 million, I think, was the estimate of savings that we could get from that. So, again, you were right there with us in terms of getting that language through, and I hope, again, we're going to take advantage of those authorities.
You will see us take advantage of those, Congressman. I think just if I could put a punctuation on the comment, in light of the discussions that we've had with our suppliers starting last fall, having candid discussions on what we need as far as requirements and expedition, and also asking what they need to go forward. The discussions now have risen to the level of, if I need 20% savings and I need a year and a half taken off, what do you need from me to get there? And it's reframing the conversation so we are having a true insight as to the availability of production capacity within the system. We will exercise all that we can do to make sure that that's the most efficient application of dollars.
Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Esper, Secretary Spencer, Secretary Wilson, thanks so much for joining us, and thanks for your service. Secretary Spencer, just yesterday, the Navy announced a request for proposals for a two-ship buy for CVN 80 and 81. We know that that is a welcomed response by the Navy to the FY18 National Defense Authorization Act, which talks about accelerating the pace to get to 355 ships. 12 of those will be aircraft carriers, so we deeply appreciate that. I think, too, it does several things. It sends a strong signal to the rest of the world that we're committed to having those 12 aircraft carriers. It's a commitment to the brave men and women in the Navy. It's also a commitment to the folks that build those ships. I think those are all extraordinarily important aspects of what we, as a team, Congress, the administration, need to do to make sure we have what's necessary going into the future. We know, too, that it's been expressed, as you said, in the negotiations and conversations with the contractors, that we can save at least $2.5 billion by buying these two ships at a time and, again, keep us on track to the 12 aircraft carriers that we need. I wanted to get your perspective on this aggressive and innovative strategy you talked about how you all are working to save money, but more specifically, what do you need from Congress as you continue down the road? Because obviously you'll get these proposals in. What do you need from Congress to not only save the $2.5 billion, but hopefully save more in looking at buying two of these ships and things that we can do to enable the Navy to implement even more aggressively this strategy?
Congressman, I appreciate tremendously your support and your subcommittee's support and the support in this room when it comes to the capital assets the Navy's looking at. When it comes to actual additional authorities, they're going to be de minimis, believe it or not. We have what we need to go forward. When it comes to funding of the two-ship, we will come before you asking on the financial side for a path forward in that way. But we really do believe that what you have given us when it comes to specifically surface ships, we have the authorities we need to go forward. Again, I go back to the understanding that we have presently in place, which was if we can find dollars in our reformation process, we can reallocate those dollars coming to you, obviously, for approval to put towards different platforms. That will be a battle cry within the Navy.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Secretary Wilson, I do want to talk a little bit about KC-46A, not to leave that off the table, but to put it in perspective, here's a platform that's been flying since 1981, and it's already been delivered in a tanker configuration to two of our allies just last week. We saw, too, Boeing reported the KC-46A program had 2 Category 1 deficiency reports, one in the remote vision system and the other in the centerline drogue system. Are these deficiencies behind the Air Force's report last week that they're going to revise the timeline for first delivery? And if not, tell me the impact of these deficiencies. And it's not just these system deficiencies, but it's also getting the FAA certifications, which I believe are still on schedule. But if you'll give us an overview about where things are, because Boeing is still saying they're going to deliver on time, the Air Force changing the timelines. Can you give us a perspective on where things are?
Yes, sir. Boeing is saying that they're going to deliver in the second quarter of 18. The Air Force thinks it's more likely to be late 18. And Boeing has been overly optimistic in all of their schedule reports. There are a couple of things that impact this. One is they have had flight test delays. So the flight test the FAA flight testing has not gone as fast as Boeing anticipated it would, and the Air Force was skeptical about its schedule when it was put forward. As you mentioned, there are 2 critical deficiencies, one being the remote vision system, and the second being a drogue disconnect that they're working on fixing. The Undersecretary of the Air Force went to Seattle last week for a deep dive with Boeing, and we have asked them to put their A-team on this to get the problems fixed and get the aircraft to the Air Force.
Okay. Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Ms. Bardeo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to Secretaries Esper, Spencer, and Wilson. Secretary Spencer, my question is for you. 2017 was challenging for the Navy, particularly with regard to the maintenance of the fleet. Numerous articles and GAO reports discussed the maintenance backlog for surface and submarine vessels. I continue to be perplexed at the Navy's mixed messaging on the state readiness in regards to depot-level ship repair. The 2017 Strategic Readiness Review highlighted that the constrained ship repair capacity is inadequate to meet the demand. Yet, when we asked if the ship repair capability was insufficient to meet requirements in the Pacific, the response was that the Navy did not agree with this. With 60% of our naval fleet operating in the Pacific region, what is the Navy's plan for depot-level ship repair in this area, and is it a priority?
Congresswoman, we have had discussions on this, and I appreciate your question. Obviously, depot-level maintenance is key to the Navy. You've heard me earlier as I was answering questions that we need to get the proper resourcing facing off our ability to access availabilities in a timely manner to get the what I call the battle rhythm of maintenance and ships out into fleet back to normal. We believe that in the North American market, with going back to appropriately funding availabilities and having the discipline to access those availabilities, we do have the capacity to get the fleet back on its feet and out the door.
So, Mr. Secretary, then would you say it's adequate or inadequate?
Between public and private, I believe it's adequate.
Thank you. Another question I have for you, the FY18 NDAA also required the Navy to report to this committee on depot-level ship repair in the Western Pacific. Earlier this year, I asked that you provide periodic updates on the progress. So what is the status of this report, and when do you expect for the report to be completed and transmitted to this committee?
I would hope that this report, Congresswoman, will be ready by the end of spring, giving you the update that you need about the assets available.
Good, good. All right. My second question, Secretary, in 2011, the DOD made the net negative commitment to reduce land holdings on Guam as part of the relocation of the U.S. Marines from Japan. Last year, the Navy submitted a report to this committee regarding the status of net negative, which included 8 additional parcels pending transfer to Gov. Guam, totaling some 114 additional acres. This commitment for the military to hold less land on Guam is key to maintaining support within our civilian community. So will you commit to providing me and the committee with an update on the status of the Navy's efforts to return these 8 parcels?
I will.
All right. And additionally, I introduced the Guam Land Return Act yesterday that included 7 additional properties requested by GovGuam agencies and Guam families for consideration as part of the net negative pledge. So will you commit to reviewing these parcels for me?
We will commit to review, Congressman.
Thank you, and I still have a little time. This question is for the panel as it relates to your area. After years of concern regarding readiness shortfalls and the impacts of sequestration, I'm concerned that the 2019 budget request may not appropriately balance long-term readiness recovery through modernization with near-term efforts through sustainment and maintenance. So with regard to the FY 2019 budget, how will the request support near-term readiness recovery, and are there specific areas in the operations and maintenance accounts, such as weapon systems and so forth? Could you help with this readiness recovery effort?
Ma'am, we're putting substantial sums of money into both O&M for near-term readiness and, of course, additional dollars for modernization account as well, double-digit spending, if you will. And so we're confident that this funding is sufficient for us to lay the groundwork to build the next generation of fighting vehicles, aircraft, et cetera. At the same time, what's the essential piece for us, we believe in the Army, is to reform the current acquisition process. So we're putting a lot of effort into that, most notably the Army Futures Command, which will be stood up this summer, which will help us maximize every one of those dollars.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And for the Air Force, I have no questions. I yield back.
Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here this morning. And my first question will be for Secretaries Spencer and Wilson, and then a couple of follow-ups. And I think I know the answer to this, but it's important to put it on the record. Under the previous administration, the #1 stated mission of the various branches, of the Department of Defense was the nuclear enterprise and its role in providing a strategic nuclear deterrent. Can you confirm that under this administration and under your stewardship, for the parts of the triad that are under your purview, that continues to be our #1 mission?
I can confirm to you, Congressman, that for the United States Navy and our understanding of total NPR and national defense strategy, it is. And I can show you by data what I mean by that. The #1 acquisition program in the United States Navy is the Columbia platform, which is the undersea leg of the nuclear triad, and that is our primary focus for the primary platform.
Sir, one of our core missions is the nuclear deterrent, and I believe that a safe and secure and reliable nuclear deterrent has helped to keep the peace since the Second World War. In the Air Force budget, we are responsible for 2 of the 3 legs of the triad. Our budget includes the modernization of the long-range standoff weapon, which is the replacement for the air-launched cruise missile, the modernization of the B-52s, the continued development of the B-21 bomber, as well as the ground-based strategic deterrent, which is the replacement for the Minuteman III. The one part that's not often focused on in the nuclear deterrent, but is funded in our budget as well as the Navy's, is nuclear command, control, and communication. And that part is also modernized in this 5-year period, and it's an extremely important part of the nuclear deterrent.
Would you go as far as to say that these things you just described are your #1 mission, or at least that nothing is higher than those missions?
So I would say nothing is higher than those missions. The Air Force provides global reach, global power, global strike, global mobility. So we provide a lot of things to the joint force, but there's nothing higher than the nuclear deterrent.
Thank you. I appreciate those answers. And Secretary Wilson, I'm really glad to see that we're going to have more money in the upcoming budget for nuclear modernization and for catching up in space. Will there have to be trade-offs, though, with the rest of your budget to accomplish those things, or will that be able to be done with new money?
So with respect to the nuclear deterrent, as I mentioned, we are doing modernization of 2 legs of the triad and also nuclear command and control. With respect to space, we're not catching up. The United States of America is the best in the world at space, and our adversaries know it. In any future conflict, we expect that they will seek to deny us the use of space as part of in any crisis or conflict. So what we are doing in this budget is accelerating our ability to defend our assets on orbit. The Air Force operates 76 satellites. Of those, 30 are GPS. We're moving to jam-proof or jam-resistant GPS. We also operate command and satellite communications. About 25 of the 76 satellites are satellite communications. We're moving towards jam-resistant satellite communications. So across the board, and then we have things that we're doing to defend other assets on orbit. So we're moving to defendable space so that we can deter and defend our assets on orbit, which we didn't have to do when we initially built this architecture. It's a challenge, but we're meeting that challenge.
Okay, and I'm really glad to hear that. To accomplish that and the acceleration you talked about, and I'm totally in support and really happy to see that. But do you anticipate any trade-offs to get there or not?
So there are always trade-offs in any budget. We deeply appreciate the increase in the top line for defense, which has allowed us to meet many of our missions and try to do so cost effectively. Because our obligation is to take every dollar that you have appropriated for us and try to do the best we can to defend the country.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ms. Songus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to our witnesses. It's good to have you here. Secretary Spencer and Secretary Wilson, I first wanted to address the ongoing physiological episodes occurring in the FA-18 community and increasingly in other aircraft throughout the Navy and the Air Force. There have been two recent incidents that underscore the urgency and persistent nature of this issue. In January, an EA-18 Growler aircraft experienced a failure in the environmental control system, causing temperatures in the cockpit to plunge to -30 degrees, resulting in a layer of ice covering the instrumentation and windows, rendering the pilots almost completely blind, according to the report. Both pilots survived, but suffered serious frostbite injuries. Most recently, 2 Navy FA-18 pilots died after ejecting from their aircraft near Naval Air Station Key West just last week. Now, while the cause of this latest incident has yet to be determined, I'm gravely concerned not only about our efforts to correct this ongoing problem, but also about the impact it may be having on the recruitment, retention, and confidence level of the pilots we asked to fly this aircraft. It is vitally important that we get to the root of this ongoing problem as soon as possible, and in particular, Secretary Spencer, I encourage the Navy to maintain the constancy of effort and expertise to help get at the bottom of this and help solve it. It's just a statement. It's something we've been monitoring in the Tactical Air and Land Subcommittee. I hear from families quite often about it. And in a recent meeting with the Chief of Naval Operations, there was a young pilot in the room who herself had 3 physiological episodes while flying for the Navy. So something we have to stay on top of, and just wanted to make that statement. Switching topic, Secretary Esper, I commend you and Army leadership for establishing a Futures and Modernization Command within the next year. Too often, too many years and too many taxpayer dollars have been misused in developing capabilities that the military services ultimately determine are no longer relevant in the face of rapid technological change and a changing threat environment, oftentimes just as you're about to make a very important investment and move forward. This problem impacts all the services, but 2 recent examples are top of mind, the Army's Network Modernization Strategy and the Air Force's follow-on JSTARS program. The services may well learn from programs that are canceled or head in a new direction, but the amount of time, the amount of money, and in particular the amount of talent we waste in learning those hard lessons is of great concern, particularly when the reasons behind these course corrections were foreseeable had our nation's greatest innovators had a seat at the table. So with that said, Secretary Esper, how do you aim to get at this problem through the proposed Futures and Modernization Command? How will the command work through anticipating what capabilities we will need in the future? The threats are not always as unknown as sometimes suggested, and equally important, what capabilities our adversaries will have in a way that is better than our process. As you said today, the focus is to save money, but to make sure we're more effective, more lethal. You have a more effective, more lethal Army. How do you see the Futures Command and Modernization Command achieving that goal?
Congresswoman, the Army Futures Command will likely do 2 things. One, will have the talent inherent from both military and civilian to look deep into the future about what the strategic threats and the operational environment may look like. That, in turn, will help inform the material solutions that we may need in that future state.
And how will that change compared to what you do now? What will be different about that?
Well, what we find now is that capability, the need to look into the future often gets lost because of the demands of the present. And by putting that responsibility in a separate command and just focused on the future, the sense is that we'll have greater focus on the future and not get lost by the present. There will be another organization responsible for maintaining focus on the near fight. The other part of what Futures Command will do, of course, is to consolidate the entire acquisition process, achieving unity of effort and unity of command, which is essential to holding people accountable and to making the system as efficient and as effective as possible. And in that way, we can line up everything under a single commander, whether it's from the concept to the requirements process, to the material development plan, all the way through engineering, manufacturing development, sustainment, testing, et cetera. We'll bring all those people together up front. And more specifically to the point you raised, and we're doing this now in the cross-functional teams, is we bring everybody to the table early, to include the private sector and academia where need be, to get those best ideas that are happening out there.
I think it requires a deep dive, and to do that, you've got to have people whose job in life has been focused on looking ahead, and not just solving a near-term problem, as has been too often the case. Thank you.
Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Spencer, this is more of a request. I know that there's a proposal to draw down either the Mercy or the Comfort. One ship operates on the East Coast, one on the West.
Hi, everybody. Just a quick reminder, Mox News survives solely on your tips and contributions. It's easy to make a contribution or a tip or leave a tip at moxnews.com, or there are clickable links in the text body of this video. It should take the average person, most people, probably less than 2 minutes. Thanks very much for your time and your continued support. Stay cool, Wednesdays. This war is going to end. Till that day.
Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Spencer, this is more of a request. I know that there's a proposal to draw down either the Mercy or the Comfort. One ship operates on the East Coast, one on the West. If those current ships are not the right platform for the mission, I can certainly understand that. They're very old. But I just want to reiterate my support for that mission and tell you that when I was in Djibouti, the Chinese had a hospital ship over there. Certainly providing health care to countries, I believe, is a vital part of our soft power, and would look forward to a meeting with the Navy about how they intend to carry out that mission if the Mercy and the Comfort are not the right platforms for that.
Rest assured, Congressman, that's front of mind. 2021 is when we have our first decision point, but obviously we're going to address it prior to that.
Yes,
we'll
sir.
keep you informed.
Thank you. Secretary Esper, Fort Stewart, we have plenty of room for another security forces brigade or a full brigade. I hope that you'll consider Fort Stewart for any additional platforms or teams, I should say. Obviously very close to the Savannah port, easy to get in and out of there, and we would love to have the additional men and women in Georgia.
Yes, sir.
Madam Secretary, Secretary Wilson, you talked a little bit about sustainment, the 3D manufacturing, the additive manufacturing, predictive analysis, and how we can use that for sustainment operations and speeding up acquisitions. Would you expand on that a little bit and include in that how we're going to handle the intellectual property contracting and the data? It seems to me that no private sector company would pay somebody to develop a computer program for them and then find out at the end of the contract that they didn't actually own the program, and how the Air Force is addressing those issues.
So with respect to intellectual property, this is one where we may need to work with the Congress. We are pushing the limits of our negotiations on intellectual property on new contracts up front. What we do find is that when we're trying to maintain older equipment, when we go out with requests for parts, then many of the manufacturers are no longer in business, and then we realize we don't have the intellectual property for the door handle on the back door of a KC-135, and so we then in some cases, the A-10 is one example, the prime contractor is not even in business anymore. So we are actually trying for our contracts going forward to get more of the data rights over time. There are a lot of different ways to negotiate that, but if we can do that, we think we can reduce the cost of sustainment over time by keeping competition in place and by being able to get other people to build parts when companies go out of business, which they do over the 20 or 30-year period for a piece of equipment. With respect to additive manufacturing and advanced manufacturing in general, we think it has tremendous promise for maintaining maintaining weapon systems and for the long logistics pipeline. So instead of having 30,000 parts, you have material and you can make the parts as you need them. We think there's tremendous opportunity there.
Yes, ma'am. I represent Robins Air Force Base, and with the CNC machining and 3D printing now that can be done, as long as you've got the schematic and the raw materials, you can manufacture the part right there as you need it. So I certainly appreciate all of your service. Look forward to continuing to work with you. And with that, I yield the remainder of my time.
Mr. Norcross.
Thank you, Chairman. Last year, we had General McDough, Transcom Commander, talk about some of the challenges he faces each and every day. And one of the items he talked about that keeps him up at night are the refuelers. We heard some questions earlier today. We go back in time, late 1950s, our KC-135s came online. Then in the early 80s, the KC-10s. You know, we've been looking at a replacement plane for those refuelers for about a decade. Secretary Wilson, we're here talking about acquisition reform. Given that the dates for these KC-46s have slipped from August of 17 to January 18, we're not sure what exactly the time frame is now. What would you do differently in the acquisition process to avoid some of the issues that we're looking at right now?
Sort of one of the first things to point out is that it's a fixed price contract with Boeing, so they are not getting any more money from us.
But the time frame.
But the time does. Time is an issue, and schedule is an issue. When they had the last slip of schedule, we got consideration from them, so they basically compensated the government for their lateness on the schedule. I expect that will be an issue in the coming months with Boeing as well for these most recent slips. We will also probably have to keep the KC-10s on longer unless they're able to catch up with procurement with producing aircraft once they get the line clear and get these problems worked out. And I expect that we will be working with them on that as well.
But in terms of moving forward, what would you have done differently if we faced the challenge of picking a new contractor today? Would you have structured it different? Would you put certain deadlines? I mean, this is a serious issue, as you well know, as anybody who flies a plane knows. Mm-hmm. How could we avoid it next time?
So I do think that there's a place here for fixed price contracting, and I think that that in this case, having done a fixed price contract with Boeing was the right thing to do. And they're not, and we have other contracts where, quite frankly, I think we have more risk and we don't have a fixed price. I do think that in this case, one of our frustrations with Boeing is that they're much more focused on their commercial activity than they are on getting this right for the Air Force and getting these airplanes to the Air Force. And that's the message we took to them in Seattle last week.
So as you pointed out, there is a fixed price, and from the dollars and cents, that's great. But extending out the two craft that we talked about, 3 additional years at minimum? We wouldn't change a thing in...
No, I share your frustration, sir. I wasn't here at the time, and I guess I haven't thought in detail. I'm not the kind of person who thinks about what I would have done in the past had I been here. I don't really think that way too much. My focus right now is to get the aircraft from Boeing and get them up there flying so that we can modernize the fleet. We currently have 457 tankers. That'll grow to 479, and as the KC-46 comes online, we will retire the KC-10s.
Thank you. I will yield back.
Mr. Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Spencer, good to see you. Listen very carefully to your opening remarks and appreciate two words that I heard loud and clear. One was people, and the other was urgency. In your written testimony, you say that the 30-year shipbuilding plan sets, quote, the conditions for an enduring industrial base, close quote. Industrial base is people, the people that work at the now just 7 shipyards that build the Navy ships. Unfortunately, your acquisition plan for small surface combatants fails to provide for an enduring industrial base. In fact, it will erode the industrial base for those ships. The Navy requested only 1 littoral combat ship for fiscal year 19 before the transition next year to the frigate. Now, the threshold problem is the Navy was supposed to have gotten the frigate done for fiscal year 19, and that predates you. But you used the word urgency. The Navy has not had urgency about this. So we're in the conundrum we're in right now because of a lack of urgency. And I have to tell you, Mr. Secretary, since you've come on board, I haven't seen the Navy pick up the urgency on this program. In fact, I see the opposite. I think you're slowing down. In fact, some people from the Navy have been in the shipyard in my hometown and said they want to know what happens if it slides further from fiscal year 20. So I think the urgency is missing there. Both of these shipyards that are making LCSs now are telling us that if we go to 1 littoral combat ship, that they'll have a dramatic erosion of the industrial base. They will lay off thousands of shipyard workers, and we'll look at the prospect of losing 1 or both of those 2 shipyards, shrinking the number of shipyards from 7 to 5. That's the industrial base. Now, Admiral Nagley, who is the LCS Program Executive Officer, I know you've renamed that program, but he was at the time when he said this, he's testified that the optimal sustaining rate for both shipyards is a total of 3 ships per year, and that's where we've been authorizing and appropriating the last several years. At the beginning of this month, Assistant Secretary Gertz said before this committee that, quote, certainly 1 LCS a year is not near the optimal rate, close quote, and he said further that this will probably cause some work turned down in those yards as we build back into the frigate, close quote. And you yourself said to the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee just a little while ago that the purchase of a single LCS was, quote, not optimal, close quote. Okay. You may say that you're concerned with the enduring industrial base, but it seems to me you've overlooked the industrial base problem we're facing this year. So please tell me, sir, why we in Congress should accept a, quote, not optimal, close quote, request for the littoral combat ship program.
Thank you, Congressman. First of all, I couldn't disagree with you more about urgency, and I'd like to invite you over for lunch and show you the programs we're doing. We're going to bring the frigate on from first discussions in 18 to contracts award in late 19 and get that thing out the door in 3 years after that. I'd like to see a comparison to any other platform we've done on that timeline. And that is what is happening under my tutelage, just so you know. But to address the question at hand, which I totally agree with you, we have to have a balanced flow through the industrial base. The way that we're looking at it now, I can only deal with what I'm funded directly in the budget requests. If, in fact, and we have had success right now of finding the dollars in reformation inside the department, can I allocate those dollars for other platforms? I'm being told, yes, now I can do that. And that is what we're doing. If you look at the $650 million that we actually extracted from de-obligation discipline, that would be an example of something that could be put towards another platform. That's the portfolio management we're struggling with. I totally understand where you're coming from. I'm working within the confines that I have. Is my desire to keep everybody healthy? Yes, it is. Will we work to get everyone healthy? Yes, we will do everything within our bounds.
Well, I appreciate and I accept your offer for lunch, by the way. I'd be happy to come over there. I was listening to some of the questions of Secretary Wilson. 10 years ago last month, the tanker was awarded to a different company, a company that's produced a tanker that is fueling American jets when we're working with our allies in NATO and Australia. If we had gone with that company, we'd have a tanker right now. You've got programs at Wisconsin and Alabama that will produce your frigate for you right now. You don't need to go to other companies. So I can't wait to have our lunch, because I look forward to talking to you about how we can avoid the mistake the Air Force made when they did what they did on the tanker program, so that we can have a frigate quicker and substantially under the cost that we're hearing from the Navy. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Moulton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question about, we've had a lot of talk about cyber and artificial intelligence, and we've mentioned briefly the conflict in space. We haven't specifically mentioned China's development of anti-satellite weapons and how they now claim to be able to take out the majority of our satellites within 48 hours, 48 hours rather, of the beginning of a conflict. These are game-changing developments in our strategic balance. My question to the service secretaries is how are you working to address these as a whole? And how are you coordinating your development of AI, of cyber capabilities, of autonomous vehicles and whatnot amongst yourselves? Secretary Wilson, would you start?
Thank you, sir. Let me start out with the cyber side. In our budget, we actually look at what are the biggest challenges we're facing on cyber. One of them is the area of joint cyber warfighting, and for us, we actually have $71 million in our budget for joint cyber warfighting command and control systems. And so that's intended to meld together the different cyber tools we have, so that a commander can see everything and be able to apply those to the fight. With respect to space, and your comment specifically with respect to Chinese capabilities, without going into too much detail, the things we worry about are jamming, direct ascent anti-satellite weapons, which the Chinese demonstrated in 2007, and they also have claimed certain co-orbital capabilities. Our job is to ensure that we deter any attack on our satellites. We're able to defend when someone attacks our satellites, and we are able to continue to operate in spite of any country's attempt to interfere with satellite communications. There is not a military mission today that doesn't in some way depend on space, and I think all of us at this table understand that, and it's our obligation to accelerate our ability to defend those assets on orbit and to make clear to any adversary that if they attack us in space, we will respond.
Madam Secretary, you said earlier that that it is clear to our adversaries that we are the unequivocal leader in space. Do you feel confident today that we have the resources to defend against such a Chinese attack?
Sir, I'd like to go into some detail with you in classified session on that matter, if I could.
Okay. Secretary Spencer.
If I look at earlier in the testimony that we're here, Secretary Wilson hit the nail on the head. We, as three secretaries, are meeting with regularity, and one of the first programs that we decided to focus on was S&T. We put our top 3 or 4 programs that we're working on, and ironically, I think 3 of them overlapped. And we are now working with Mike Griffin and others to see how we can best pool our dollars to make sure that we are going in the most effective, efficient manner, most expeditiously, rather than going up 3 stovepipes separately.
Secretary Spencer, China has made an unequivocal statement that they intend to be the world leader in AI and artificial intelligence by 2020 or 2030. Are you prepared to counter that statement? Do you think that
I think we have to, and we have to put the resources against it. If I look at the assets available to us, the Naval Postgraduate School is a fine example. It's a national treasure that we need to leverage in this area.
Secretary Esper, if I may change subjects briefly because I'm running out of time, I'm concerned about numerous reports that my office has received about a reduction in training standards of our ground forces. Now, this applies, Secretary Spencer, to reports we've heard from the Marines as well. But if you could answer, do you intend to allow any reductions in training standards, which seems to me would counter the emphasis that you've put on the need to have a ready force?
Thank you, Congressman. We are not reducing training standards. If anything, we are increasing them. For example, we are looking at a new physical fitness test that will improve across the board the physical fitness of our soldiers and prepare them for the demands of combat. We are looking at a change to basic training that would extend it and also put additional skills in there and a crucible-type exercise at the end. So there are a number of things that we are doing to enhance the readiness of the soldier, both physically and tactically and with their skills, so that they're ready.
Secretary Spencer, can you just comment quickly on the reports of the infantry officer course in the Marine Corps lowering standards?
Yes, no standards are being lowered, Congressman. One of the things that we did do was we amended the actual logistics on how people go through the IOC course, but standards remain the same.
Thank you, Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. McSally.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to first note for the record that I remain strongly opposed to the Army's decision to close down Apache battalions in the National Guard, while at the same time growing attack aviation battalions from scratch in the active duty force. As I've said many times, this wastes millions of dollars, thousands of years of specialized experience invested in hundreds of pilots and maintainers. We went to the mat to fight for more resources for our military over these last months, and the very week the budget deal was signed into law, a combat-ready unit in Arizona was told to transfer its Apaches and shut down. And a Pennsylvania company will come home from deployment and lower their flag. I don't want to take the rest of my time to hear again the justification for this decision, but I want to note for the record my very strong opposition. On to another attack asset, Secretary Wilson. 2 years ago, we sat in a similar hearing with previous Air Force leadership arguing strongly about the need to keep the A-10 Warthog. We won. Since then, the A-10 has been pivotal, shwacking ISIS, deployed to the European defense, been ready south of the DMZ, and we've now been sent back to Afghanistan. I'm grateful for your support for this critical, unique capability, including funding for the A-10 in the last 2 years' budget requests and the commitment to the re-winging of the remaining 109 of the 281 A-10s that need it. There's been some reports, though, that divestment will still commence in a few years and other public statements saying it will fly well into the 2030s and beyond. So can you state for the record how long you plan to have the A-10 in the inventory?
Ma'am, we expect the A-10 to continue flying at least until 2030. The FY18 budget, if the omnibus comes out in the way that we expect it to, will restart the line for the re-winging and will include enough money for about 4 more re-wings on top of the 170 plus that are already re-winged. The FY19 budget request includes $80 million for additional re-wingings of the A-10. We'll go out for a bid, but we think that'll get us between 8 and 12 more in FY19.
Great, thank you for clarifying that. And I know you mentioned in your testimony, but if you have any insights on, in order to conduct the National Defense Strategy, we're down to now 55 fighter squadrons. We used to have 134 fighter squadrons around Desert Storm, and many of those squadrons are actually 18 PAA, primary aircraft assigned, versus the 24 PAA we had in the past. So how many fighter squadrons do you think you need in order to execute the National Defense Strategy?
Congresswoman, we currently have 56 fighter squadrons. We've just gone through a 53-day deep dive exercise on readiness, and we're also looking at the total number of squadrons required to execute the National Defense Strategy. And so we're doing that over this year leading up to the FY20 POM. I would say that one of the things on readiness that we're really focused on is the 301 operational combat squadrons and how do we better support the structure that we have. The guidance in the National Defense Strategy was to increase capability before we increase capacity. In other words, make sure we've got ready forces now before we just try to expand force structure.
Great, thanks. So you expect when you think you'll have a sense of how many squadrons you actually need?
I think we need to do that in preparation for the FY20 budget submission, which for us is over the next 6 months.
Okay, great. I know there's been some discussion as to whether that will, as you're growing, whether we will, if we keep the A-10 into the inventory, which I appreciate, well into the 2030s, whether that will be the 9 squadrons that we currently have, or going down to the 6. I am concerned at the rate that we'll be re-winging the remaining 109, that we're going to have a bathtub and lose that capability. So can you comment at all about where that fits in there, and are you looking to build squadrons back from 18 to 24 PAA in the process?
Ma'am, one of the issues on 18 to 24 aircraft per squadron is what does it do for readiness, particularly when you do split operations, which you understand certainly better than I do and a lot of other people. And that's one of the things we're looking at when we're going into a high-end fight. And one of the things we've seen is that over the last 17 years, we've been cannibalizing the Air Force to roll forces forward on a mature infrastructure and command and control. That's not what we're being asked to do in the new National Defense Strategy. So how do we organize ourselves for that high-end fight? And it affects A-10s as well as all of our other aircraft. The other thing that I would also mention with respect to squadrons is that we have the continued funding in our budget for the light attack aircraft, which is not a substitute for the A-10, but could expand the number of squadrons that we have in this 5-year period. And our intention is to try to use light attack aircraft to reduce the operating tempo on 4th and 5th generation aircraft that should be focusing on training for the high-end fight.
Great, thanks. I'm over my time.
Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here. All of you have mentioned that we need to take the necessary steps, such as investing in modernization and further improving the acquisition process to ensure our service members have the best capabilities and training for mission success wherever they go. However, one of the most important responsibilities is not just that they are ready to fight, but ensuring that they are healthy and fostering a positive morale and well-being. And a part of that is looking at the conditions of their daily lives. We are focusing on modernizing our capabilities, but I also want to make sure we are also taking a close look at the conditions where our service members eat and sleep. For example, I represent Camp Roberts in my district. It is a National Guard base where they train and house soldiers and Marines year-round. Many are trained and housed at Camp Roberts before they are deployed. And what concerns me is that we are allowing these service members to sleep in facilities that are World War II era, and many of which I believe should be demolished and replaced. Some of these buildings are contaminated with asbestos, and honestly, I believe this is unacceptable. I am fully aware these conditions are prevalent among a number of bases and installations, and I understand military construction funding is all but vast. But as we look to modernizing the military, this is an area that cannot be ignored. Is this something the services are focusing on? Is there a capital improvement plan? Are there any timelines where our investments are focused as priorities? And how are we ensuring that our service members are not just being provided the best equipment and training, but the best accommodations?
Thank you, sir. I'll take a response to that question first. As I travel around the Army, and I've done a lot of that in the last 3 months, I spend a lot of time talking with soldiers across all components. And in my conversations with soldiers, we talk about these types of issues. And with regard to the Guard, I know there are those concerns out there with regard to facilities. So I'm not familiar with the situation at Camp Roberts. What we do is endeavor, as we look at our military construction projects, to make sure that we bring all of our soldiers' living conditions up to a certain standard. I think the Guard prioritizes within their component, but this is something I'll take back and go look at Camp Roberts and find out the specifics there, because I have not heard about this situation.
Congressman, as far as your Navy Marine Corps team, when we talk about quality of life and specifically infrastructure, interestingly enough, when I talk about infrastructure and address it, it's under the readiness column. We truly believe that not only well-being of our people, but well-being of our equipment, et cetera, and the infrastructure that supports it is a major component of readiness. It has always been an anathema to me that we fund at 70+%. We've moved it up. We're going to fund this year at 80% of the needed requirement. But this is where we get down to the painful nature of portfolio management as to where dollars should go. It is readily apparent, not only with our soldiers, but out in the Pacific Northwest at the shipyards. We went and saw people who were working on lathes with tents over them because of what was falling off the ceiling above them. thank God we have workers that can actually put up with those conditions and keep producing for us. But we have to focus on the infrastructure, yes.
The last thing I will ask all of you, and if we run out of time, if you could give me some answers. You know, we always hear about the continuous process improvements that all the branches are taking to modernize our acquisitions process, all kinds of things that we are doing. But because of change of commands, how do you ensure that there's continuity of implementing priorities and implementing these continuous process improvements within personnel so that they could withstand changing the commands at different levels? How do you case manage that as branches?
If you're talking about large, Congressman, what we do is we have very established metrics, if you will, with regard to readiness that assesses training, equipment readiness, personnel deployability, et cetera, with hard metrics that we continue to try and make more and more objective. We do the same with regard to infrastructure in terms of the conditions of barracks or quarters or buildings. And so the enduring piece of that is, of course, those metrics. It's complemented by the fact that, you know, as the civilian workforce, which is fairly steady and not changing as much as the uniformed military, gives us also the means to track and ensure there's continuity throughout the process.
Thank you. I'm out of time. If you could get me that in writing, I appreciate it. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretaries, for being here. It's quite an honor to have all of you here at the same time. First of all, Secretary Wilson, I disagree that 50% of us would have thought of their mothers. I think that number would be closer to 90%, if not greater. And I truly mean that. They're the protectors of all our families, and I think your number, I think it was well said, but I think the numbers were too low. Second, Secretary Esper, I want to go back to the Apache issue. You can't do 18 ships in a guard unit and 24 in an active duty unit and tell me that they're the same. That's just not true. If we're going to fight as one Army, we've got to look the same across the board. We can't do it with Charlie models while the new active guys get Echo models. That doesn't work. And so we have the best maintainers and best pilots in the world in the Army National Guard Apache pilots. They have more experience, and our maintainers have more experience than their active counterparts. And I just ask that we really push to make sure that we don't do away with that combat aviation in the Army. And I know y'all are working on it, but I think ARI got it wrong. And I think the 18 versus 24 ship is not a fix, and I think long-term it's going to cause issues. So I just hope you'll relook that. Second, I want to talk about engineers. We've been talking about new engineer equipment since I joined and got commissioned as an engineer lieutenant in 1988. And we're talking about new short gap crossing and wet gap crossing and all those things. And we've had all kind of plans and equipment, but we've never implemented any of those. And so we still have the same bridges that we had when I was a second lieutenant in 1988, the same AVLB. There is technology that is stronger, lighter, quicker that we can do. Sometimes, though, I think we forget about our engineer, our gap crossing, and if we don't have mobility or freedom of movement, we can't do anything. And so I hope that the Army will look at not just talking about what the new plans for our mobility is, but look at the bridging requirements that we have in some theater of operations. We want to always fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I really don't need a question. I hate that, but I think you're doing a great job. Continue that, but those are two things. And I do want to touch one more thing on as far as how we live as the Guard. Let me just tell you, many times when a Guard unit mobilizes, they live in lesser conditions that the Army would not even live in. And if it's because we are practicing being remote, I'm fine with that, as my 155 soldiers are about to do at Bliss. But if the active component is not doing the same thing, we need to fix that, and we don't need to ask the Guard guys to live in tents when the active guys are living in nice barracks. And so I just want to make sure it's for the right reasons, and thank you so much for your service. Secretary Wilson, ISR, the J-STARS, that's a mistake. Let me tell you, when you have a thirst for intelligence, as all our services have, and we're talking about taking a platform out of service to have something that replaces it in 2035, yet the requirements are not going down, that is not an acceptable answer for a guy who lives and dies by that intelligence on the ground. So can you tell me there's a plan in place to do something for the intelligence that JSTARS is currently collecting between now and 2035 when the replacement starts coming online?
Yes, sir. One of the things that makes this possible is, in fact, the assessment that we will continue to fly JSTARS through the mid-2020s. So what we're doing here is comes in three increments. The first increment is kind of now to 2023, where we will have the current JSTARS. We will build additional MQ-9 Reapers that have ground-moving target indicators. We will modernize the E3G AWACS system, including support for the new ground-moving target indicator software, and we will enhance their Link 16 capability, which has to do with their communications, as well as building additional space-based capability with the National Reconnaissance Office. So that is the first increment. The second increment starts in
If I can let you finish the other, I'll just tell you, I think there's still an ISR capability gap from 2025 to 2035 that we can't afford. And I'm sorry, but I wanted to get with Secretary Spencer real quickly. This hospital ship is a big deal. And the same thing, we don't need to be talking about what we're going to do in 2021 about removing something from the inventory. We need to have a replacement before we remove that. Whether that means upgrading what we currently have or getting something else. My understanding is, and I may be wrong, tell me if I am, is that we have a national security requirement for 2 hospital ships. Yet we're not going to meet that starting in 2021 because we're retiring one of the 2 hospital ships. And again, that's a capability gap in soft power and also serving our ally or serving us in a time of war. Just can you assure me we're not going to have a capability gap in hospital ships?
Congressman, I can. Much like the Ticonderoga, it was coming up for decommissioning, and we put a SLEP program, a service life extension program on. We will address this and make sure that we don't have the gap.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank each of you for not only your service to our warfighters and their families, but also to each of you for your prior service in uniform. Thanks for being here today. Secretary Esper, it was a pleasure meeting you, sitting down with you 2 or 3 weeks ago in my office. I'd like to follow up on the Army Futures Command and ask you a question or two about that. You identify that as one of your 3 priorities to improve modernization. You said today, as well as in your written statement, it's integral to reforming our acquisition process. Your Undersecretary McCarthy has sort of characterized it as a realignment. You've characterized it as a consolidation. General Murray testified last month on the Senate side. He testified that it's projected, the Army Futures Command is projected to be, at least initially, operationally capable by June or July of this year, and fully operational next year. When are we going to see a concept plan or some other document that sort of, at least in an outline form, lays out the purpose, the organization, the resources, what the realignment and consolidation might consist of? When will we see something like that?
Sir, the Undersecretary of the Army will be coming up this week to brief the committee, staff on it, and members who are interested.
Great. Well, while you're here, can you make your best elevator pitch? Because there are some skeptics, there are a lot of supporters. What's the pitch? Why a new command and new processes and not just improving current processes in existing commands?
Well, I think I don't need to cite some of the past failures the Army has had with regard to major acquisition programs. When you look at the various reports that have come out in the past, such as the Decker-Wagner report and testimony of experts in committees such as this over the years, they cite a number of consistent items, first of which is a requirements process, which is unwieldy and is in some ways never-ending. And they speak to a culture of risk aversion. And they speak to a lack of accountability. So those are just 3 things. There's a longer list, of course. What the Army Futures Command proposes to do is to take these disparate functions that are currently spread out across the Army and align them. So you could either say you're aligning them or you're consolidating, but the bottom line is you're putting under a single commander who is now responsible for materiel acquisition from concept all the way through production. Sustainment will remain with Army Materiel Command. And so that's what you have. So you have a single person responsible, you have accountability, you have unity of effort, so now a single commander can work that technology from, again, concept, S&T, all the way through. You can utilize the lessons we've learned so far with regard to use of the cross-functional teams, whereby you bring everybody to the table at the beginning of the process. You bring the PMs, you bring the contractors, you bring the budget folks, you bring the testers, all the way around, and you make sure they sit at the table and we discuss requirements then and there so that you don't get requirements creep.
So we'll see something next week.
You'll see, you will be briefed if you want, and certainly the staff will be briefed this week on some of the details.
Secretary Spencer, I had some of that good Navy coffee. I was aboard the USS Gonzales just last week in Norfolk, and I was on the bridge. I was on the bridge on that destroyer. Last year, I was on the USS Nimitz, and as you know, that space is very busy. A bridge on a destroyer, an aircraft carrier. It's sophisticated, a lot of equipment, a lot of technology, a lot of moving people. That same day, I visited a simulator, a bridge simulator, and we looked at the USS Porter scenario, which happens in the Strait of Hormuz, and now they'll be training on the Fitzgerald and McCain simulation. My concern that I want to raise to you is I was struck by the disparity in the level of, let's say, modernization on a real deck or bridge and the lack of sophistication in the simulators. It would be like asking an F-35 pilot to train on an F-4 Phantom simulator. I would just ask that you take a look at that, and as we're fielding a variety of vessels in the Navy, that we give our seamen an opportunity to train in what I think would be a more realistic scenario, which is a space that more closely resembles what they'll actually be driving on the high seas and in the narrow straits.
Congressman, I look forward to inviting you over probably this fall to see some of the new training aspects that we're going to introduce to the fleet. The CR that was signed out by the CNO addresses our biggest dollar request out of the CR, which is bridge commonality, to bring the technology amongst all the surface ships we have into some sort of uniformity, and the training to go along with that.
Great. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank each of you for your service. You're serving at an incredible time. This is the time where Congress will be reversing the cuts and diminishing of our capability in our military and providing funding for the purposes of rebuilding, trying to address the issue of readiness, trying to address the issues of stalled modernization, and then look to the future as to what other modernization that we need to do. But for some of our programs that we have currently ongoing, Madam Secretary, I want to ask you a question about the F-35, a couple questions. One, as you know, as we look to the F-35, one of the major criticisms are cost, and that relates both to production and to sustainment. We always think of a to-do list with respect to the contractors that are involved, but what things should we be looking to that are our responsibility that we could do better to help reduce those costs with the F-35? And both in sustainment and acquisition. And then secondly, the Nuclear Posture Review recommends that the United States retain the longstanding ability to forward deploy dual-capable aircraft. Part of that is dependent upon our NATO allies, and right now our NATO allies are going through the process of determining whether or not they participate in the F-35 and its dual-capable aircraft capability. Right now, Belgium is in the process of making a decision that may not go in our favor and certainly would affect that ability. So if you could give us a description of what should we be doing on what is our to-do list with respect to reducing costs, and secondly, on the dual-capable aircraft, what else should be on our to-do list to ensure that our allies participate and that we're able to keep that important capability of forward-deployed aircraft?
Thank you, sir. With respect to the F-35, there really are two pieces. One is the purchase price, and the second is sustainment. With respect to the purchase price, for the F-35A by FY19, we expect the purchase price to be less than $80 million a copy for the F-35A, which actually compares favorably with fourth-generation aircraft. So the capability that we get with the F-35, particularly when you combine it with other systems in the air, is actually quite good value for the money. We are continuing to drive down the costs of purchase and as you know, this is a joint program that's managed by the Office of the Secretary of Defense for all of the services. But I've been pleased to see their seriousness in their negotiating with Lockheed Martin to drive down the cost of the purchase price. We are now shifting to look at the sustainment issue. And I think as customers for the F-35, we've been a little bit frustrated at how quickly or not quickly we move forward to look at sustainment and making sure that we have the parts and competition for parts going forward to drive down those costs. I think the F-35 is probably a good example of where we can use new ways of getting parts and supplies. And we had a discussion about that here before on intellectual property and new ways of doing advanced manufacturing and advanced logistics, predictive maintenance, to drive down the cost of sustainment and to get airplanes in the air at a cheaper cost. With respect to the allies and the dual-capable aircraft, if I could take that question for the record, I will get you a more full answer.
Thanks. And turning to the Army, Mr. Secretary, the part of our European Reassurance Initiative also included forward deployment of capability, and we found in undertaking that a number of the allies did not have infrastructure that would allow basic equipment to move across their borders or even through their country, which of course inhibits our ability overall to defend that territory. As part of that, the European Reassurance Initiative had a number of costs that the United States taxpayer was billed to fix those things. How do we capture what those bills were and make certain that our allies fix those permanently?
Sir, you outlined a very critical problem with the European theater. As I've been able to talk to units who've come back from training there, and during my visits there, you're correct, there are infrastructure challenges that prevent or inhibit intra-theater movement. So it's everything from inadequate bridging, paperwork, insufficient road networks, and I've talked to European allies about it, and I know that's something they're addressing. With regard to dollars in ERI or EDI that goes specifically to that, I'm not familiar with that, so what I'd like to do is take that back for the record and get you an answer.
Great, thank you. Madam Secretary, we undertook a study on Space Corps that is in the last National Defense Authorization Act. We expect that report to come out. What are some of the things that you would expect to be in the report?
Sir, we gave you kind of an update on where we are in doing that assessment, but the assessment won't be complete until August. But I think one of the areas where we're making a lot of progress right now is focusing on acquisition. And Space and Missile Systems Center out of California is leading that effort to look at how do we move faster with acquisition in space, and then how do we systematically focus on innovation in the area of space.
Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a general question for the panels. Russia will likely never actually present us with an Article 5 violation. Instead, they'll act like petulant little teenagers. I've said this before many times in this committee, and just try to do go below a full invasion, but enough to, I think, cause havoc for our allies, whether it's through hybrid warfare or any other pre-stage invasion plans. So what are we doing specifically to fortify ourselves, our NATO allies, as well as our near NATO allies, such as Sweden and Finland, in preparation for some type of action of that nature that Russia would likely take? And we could just start with Secretary Esper and move to the right.
Well, I think as we've discussed, funding such as the European Defense Initiative gives us a lot of additional funds to conduct these heel-to-toe armor brigade combat deployments every 9 months to and from the European theater. That provides great assurance to our allies where they are deployed. We also have forces deployed in Poland, providing reassurance and deterrence there, particularly in critical elements. We support some of the enhanced forward presence packages that are in the Baltics. We are conducting multinational training at the Joint Maneuver Readiness Center in Germany. I had the privilege of being there where a Polish brigade was conducting multinational training with a UK Recce unit, Italian artillery unit, U.S. forces stationed under it. So we're doing a lot of things from the training aspect to deployment. I spoke earlier today about how we are upgunning Stryker vehicles and putting an additional brigade combat team set in Europe, again, to further enable our employment of forces in theater and further deter any type of Russian bad behavior.
Great. Secretary Spencer.
Looking at Secretary Mattis's compete, deter, win, he has his three primary drivers, which are combat credible forces, a constellation of allies, and reform. Under constellation of allies, I can tell you the Department of the Navy has been working very closely with both allies and friends, specifically when it comes to the Russian irritant. If I could bring you into a different environment, I can tell you things we were doing with Norway, the UK, et cetera. But well known that we are talking to them actively, supporting them any way we can, both in training, equipment, strategy, and policy.
Secretary Wilson.
So I would just add to that, the National Defense Strategy is driving what the Air Force is doing, and the refocus on both the Russian and the Chinese threats. In addition to the European Defense Initiative, or under the European Defense Initiative, which my colleagues mentioned, the Air Force is putting an effort this year into 5 bases, which would be forward bases that we would rotate to in the event of conflict in Europe. We also have a bomber presence that we have been rotating through in exercises in Europe, and I think those are part of demonstrating to our allies that we are good allies and partners, and countries that have allies thrive, and those that don't have allies do not.
Thank you. Secretary Wilson, I just actually met with former Supreme Allied Commander General Breedlove, and he published an issue briefing calling for a significant beefing up of our air defense plans and capacity in the NATO airspace. What are you proposing to enhance our capabilities and capacity to respond to the threats, to those threats, and to our allies also?
So our budget proposal includes, I think it's $11 billion total for next generation air dominance. It's a family of systems approach that intends to be able to gain air superiority, including in contested domains, which is what we find in Europe and also in the Indo-Pacific. In that family of systems, there will be renewed emphasis on electronic warfare, which we do in concert with our allies from the Navy. But when you think of air dominance and air superiority, no country can put a wooden block over in its airspace. It's more like Swiss cheese. And our effort as an Air Force is to try to exploit the holes and take down those air defenses so that we can operate as a joint force in Europe.
Excellent. And Mr. Spencer, if we control the sea, we control, obviously, our fate. And specifically talking about Russian aggression. What are we doing right now in terms of our wider national security strategy to make sure that we have dominance in the Atlantic, the Baltic Sea, and the Norwegian Sea to counter what I would say is Russian aggression right now for later stage war?
Topically, Congressman, I can address some things right now, but I'd like to do it in a different environment. We can get much more granular. But needless to say, it's both on the air, on the sea, and under the sea, where we are focusing on all movements in that area. Again, in concert with both our other 2 services when it comes to on land, in air, it's a fairly well tightly woven tapestry.
Thank you, Judge. I yield back.
Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There was a comment made at the beginning of the hearing. I don't know if it might have been the ranking member, but to the effect of this will likely be the largest the defense budget will be over the course of the decade. I hope that's not the case, because that means we will have failed in our effort to rebuild the military. And I just bring that up to suggest that the top-line fight, while we may have won an initial skirmish here, is going to be increasingly important and more difficult, precisely because we are giving you more money going forward, and we're going to need your help in making the case. And I would like to follow up at some point on Moulton's question about lowering of standards for IOC, because it's my understanding that we've gotten rid of the initial INDOC, but I don't want to spend much of my time on that. Secretary Spencer, I would like to ask about the 30-year shipbuilding plan, because I do think it is an unusual document, and by that I mean, on one hand, in no uncertain terms, it states that a plan to achieve today's warfighting requirement in 3 decades represents an unacceptable pace in context with worldwide, if you could, an unacceptable pace with worldwide threats that we're facing. And I just want you to elaborate, if you can, on the factors that make this plan unacceptable from the Navy's perspective, and why the Navy put forth a plan in the first place that failed to meet this basic threshold.
The whole reason for that document to be put out there, Congressman, was to have the discussion that we're having right now. We wanted to put forth the two curves that we talk about in that document. One is a curve that is sustainable within the budget and portfolio management that I've been charged with. And two, if in fact we wanted to enhance that curve, it allowed you to see where the industrial capability was to tackle that. I cannot sit here and balance, to be very frank with you, the portfolio I have, I'll rephrase that. I believe we have balanced the portfolio we have in the best way we have with the resources available to us, even with the top line you've provided us in that plan. Could we do it better? Could we do it stronger? If in fact there were the resources, yes, we could.
But does the Navy believe that it is in fact unacceptable for us to get to 355 ships in 3 decades? In less than 3 decades, or?
If we are charged with the task that we are charged right with now, it's going to be difficult, yes.
Okay. And then just on what my colleague, Mr. Byrne, brought up, I know we've had this conversation many times, but I just too want to emphasize, if we zero out additional work, as we're currently at risk to do, as in no congressionally added LCS or EPFs, and no foreign military sales in FY19 to fill the gap, in your opinion, Mr. Secretary, would only one ship of any class in total between the 2 yards be an acceptable outcome with respect to the health of the industrial base?
That's what I was speaking to Congressman Byrne about. Again, it is in our purview to find the resources necessary to balance the health of those any of the industrial base that we have. Does one work? No, one is definitely not optimal. Can we sit here within our bounds and try to move foreign military sales to the left? That's a lever. Do we have the ability to actually find resources to fund a different platform internally within our budget? That's a lever. Those are the things that we'll be looking at.
I appreciate that and really look forward to working with you on that. I think we all, as I've said to you many times, we all want the same thing.
Exactly.
We want a robust and open, we want the best frigate possible. We want to keep the yards alive to make that competition robust and also to make good on the investments we've made there. Secretary Wilson, there was a memo reportedly directing the Air Force to share less with the public. I'm paraphrasing grossly, I apologize, but I'm running out of time. But I'm sure you're aware of the memo, and I just want to know, did concerns driving that memo originate within the Air Force, or were they in response to external direction in the department? And if so, have the other services received the same direction to be more closed-mouth for whatever reason, perhaps operational security?
That memo came from the Chief of Staff and I, and it has to do with operational security. We have an obligation to be transparent, but not with things that our adversaries could use against us. And it was time to do a reset and a retraining of our commanders and public affairs officials, which we have done. Interesting to me, the press did not know that we had done the reset until they found the memo. So it obviously didn't affect how we were engaging with the media. What we do need to make sure is that our commanders do not release operational details that are classified or that could help our enemies.
I appreciate that. I think we all want the same thing. At the same time, though, and I know I've said this to the Navy before, we're really going to need your guys' help in making the case publicly for what the fleet of the future looks like, what the Air Force of the future looks like, so that we can have that public support to make the argument for a higher top line in a very difficult security environment going forward. With that, I yield.
That is my intent, sir.
Mr. Heiss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Esper, let me start this with you. In your written testimony, you stated that an important part of the Army's effort to maintain readiness for major combat operations includes this Security Force Assistance Brigade. Can you explain further as to why SFABs are so important for readiness in the Army?
Yes, Congressman. If you look at what the situation has been the last several years as we have provided assistance and training to our Afghan partners, what that has done is consumed an infantry brigade combat team, 3,000 plus personnel who were separated from their command, not conducting the missions, and therefore quickly losing their readiness. And in the context of what we face now, consistent with the National Defense Strategy, less prepared to fight these high-end fights, if you will. So the solution, the idea of the Chief of Staff was to create a Security Force Assistance Brigade that requires fewer troops, in this case 816 versus 3,000 plus, that were also specially trained and equipped to do this type of training. And the personnel are specially selected. They have already had a company command or a battalion command, and so they come with it with their own skills as well. And the view is that this would, again, relieve the demand and therefore help preserve the readiness of our infantry brigade combat teams that have been doing that type of training for years now.
Thank you. And I would just urge as well your consideration for Fort Stewart on that. I think we're well prepared for that. Let me ask each of you, let me do this, each of you real quickly, because all of you have mentioned the problems with acquisition. Of course, we've made great strides in trying to deal with acquisition reform on this side, but each of you have mentioned it. I've done a little bit of research, and it seems that the Section 809 panel has come out with some interesting ideas to try to streamline the process. So my question is, are each of you looking at their recommendations?
Yes, Congressman, I can tell you that we are. Secretary Wilson hit on something that we're really kind of drilling down in the Navy, and that's OTAs, other transactions. We've had that ability to do that, and it's always kind of intrigued me that we haven't grasped that with greater vigor. And I think it really is just an educational process amongst the acquisition professionals.
Okay.
Yes, sir. We are making much greater use of OTAs, for example, as well. I will tell you from over FY17 to FY16, we've seen a 60% increase in our use of OTAs. It reinforces the approach, the new approach we're taking, whereby we prototype, test, fail, prototype, test, fail, repeat until we, again, refine the requirements and really get a good understanding of the technology. So that authority's been very helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Sir, with respect to other transaction authorities, our light attack experiment was done under another transaction authority, and we went from with 4 pages of requirements. We went from a letter of invitation to having aircraft on the ramp to test in 5 months. But it's not just light attack. We're doing it in command, control, communication, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. We have a consortium through Air Force Research Lab that on plug-and-play capabilities for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. We have more than 70 companies involved in that effort. We used another transaction authority for that. And we also put together what we call a Space Enterprise Consortium. We announced it in January. We put $100 million into that pot to do other transaction authority agreements to get some innovation going and prototyping into space. We now have, in 2 months, we have over 100 companies that are part of that consortium using other transaction authority.
So you are looking at those recommendations?
Yes, sir, we are.
Okay, all right. And Secretary Wilson, you've already hit on this, so let me hit on the other 2 secretaries as it relates to cybersecurity and cyber warfare priorities. How have you prioritized this in the FY 2019?
It is definitely a priority. If you look at both the Navy and the Marine Corps, Navy Digital Warfare Office, the Marine Corps, the Cyber Warfare Office, we are totally front and center on it, staffing it and standing it up.
Okay.
Sir, I was very pleased when I came into this job a little over 3 months ago to find that the Army has stood up an Army Cyber Command. We have a cyber MOS, a cyber branch. We are building capabilities. We have 42 teams across the Army right now, with another 21 coming on board in the Guard and Reserve. And then thinking about how we employ them in our formation. So the Army is all in on cyber, and we're putting the monies necessary to make sure that we can conduct both defensive and offensive operations.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Obviously, what's happening at Fort Gordon with the Cyber Command is enormously critical, and we all know the importance of cyber across the board. So thank each of you for that. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Bacon.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your leadership here today and what you're doing. One of the things that we put in our NDAA priority list out of our office is trying to speed up the delivery of electronic warfare capabilities. For example, the replacement of the Compass Call. So look forward to working with you on that, because I think it's really needed. We have very old airframes flying that right now, and they're used nonstop every day. My first question to you is, when we talk to the service chiefs, they say our readiness levels are the lowest they've been since 1977. Now, with the new NDAA, we've upped spending by 10%. If we can hold this with inflation over the next 2, 3, 4 years, what's your prognosis on when we're going to get healthy again? Is it going to take 3 years, 5 years? If we can hold it with this spending level with inflation?
Sir, We are actually, and I mentioned it before, doing a deep dive on readiness to see if we can accelerate the readiness recovery, particularly with the frontline forces, the blunt forces, if you will. I would say for the Air Force, readiness recovery is first and foremost about people. We lost 30,000 people in the Air Force in the wake of sequester, and we have hollowed out a number of units, particularly on the maintenance side of things, but also on logistics, and so we need to put people back. We're recovering on the maintenance side, but now we've got to season those people from being apprentices up to being master craftsmen. The second area is parts, spare parts and spares. So we're putting a fair amount of money into that. And the third has to do with training and having the right simulators and the right ranges to be able to train and prepare for the high-end fight. I think this, we just got this report from this readiness task force that we stood up, and I may have more information to share with the committee once we completely digest it as to how we think we can get back to readiness faster.
Thank you.
If I'm to look at the Navy, sir, every single major readiness count is funded either to 100% or industrial capacity, except for infrastructure, which is funded at 80%. The easiest algorithm to use for the Navy is cycle, debt to dwell. So we want to make sure we can get back on a debt to dwell, both the Navy and Marine Corps, for the quality of life for our sailors and Marines. And the same goes for our capital assets, to get them back into availabilities on a regular basis, hold the discipline of keeping those calendar days in place, while also managing the demand signals from the combatant commanders. But I would say 2020 is probably the target we're looking for.
That's better than I thought.
That's not without a lot of work, Congressman.
We like you working hard.
Congressman, the Army is more ready today than we were a year ago. That's the good news, and that's due in large part to the support of Congress. Going forward, we anticipate meeting our readiness goal, or the Chief does, in the FY 21 to 23 timeframe. That is assuming that we get predictable, adequate, sustained, and timely funding. So as we talked earlier, the challenges of CRs is that it inhibits that type of readiness growth.
Yes.
But we're on target in terms of people, equipment readiness, the training we need to conduct, and of course a lot of the monies for FY19 will go into upgrades and other improvements that we need to meet the National Defense Strategy. Again, that's barring no change in demand as well.
Right. What I wanted to do is just make a point on this next topic I wanted to bring up. Each of you have installation authorities or taking care of installations, say in Europe. One thing that's come to our attention is some of our installations in Europe are dependent on Russian gas, which doesn't make sense because they're why we're there. And if hostilities or tensions rose, you could expect that gas to be shut off. So I just wanted to ask you to maybe take a look at that and see what kind of resilience we need there. It was in our most recent NDA to analyze. Secretary Wilson, how are we doing on the pilot shortage, for one? And two, if I could, it's a related question, how do we know the bonus works? Because when I ask the Air Force this, they'll say, well, this is our retention, but we don't know, even if we didn't have the bonus, how many of those would be retained anyway? Because I think there's other factors in the bonus, such as new aircraft, flying time, and all that. So I appreciate your insights.
Sir, with respect to the pilot shortage, we were 2,000 pilots short at the end of the last fiscal year. Just so everyone understands, we take that risk. We underfill pilot positions in staffs, and we are more than 95% covered in our cockpits. So we put people in our cockpits to keep our readiness high. We're trying to solve this with really two parts. One is to produce more pilots. We have a national shortage of pilots, and the airline industry is hiring over 4,500 pilots a year. And it's very hard to get into an airline cockpit now unless you come from the military and a small number of crop dusters and other things. So we've got to produce more pilots. In fiscal year 16, we produced about 1,000 pilots. We're trying to grow our pilot production to about 1,400 a year. Second is retention, and some of it's financial. Most of it is non-financial and quality of life, quality of service. And I'm happy to follow up with you.
Thank you, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ms. Cheney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's wonderful to see everybody, and appreciate your sticking around to the end or close to the end here. Secretary Wilson, my first question is for you. We've worked very hard to make sure that we are lifting those things that have handcuffed, that we have, in ways we've handcuffed ourselves, things like beginning now the process of getting the resources the military needs in order to begin the rebuild. One of the things I'm very concerned about, though, is the INF Treaty and the ongoing danger, frankly, that we put ourselves in. We heard just last week in open testimony here the extent to which our obligations under the INF Treaty are constraining research and development of hypersonic capabilities. So could you talk a little bit about that issue in particular and how we get to a place where we recognize we are now the only nation in the world that's constrained by the INF Treaty and how we get ourselves out from under that situation?
My other colleagues may want to comment on this. I don't think it constrains our hypersonic research or our other research.
Maybe we can talk about that separately, but yeah. Last week the open session testimony was very much that it has an impact and constrains because we conduct our research in a way that we are sure is not going to violate our obligations under the INF Treaty when deployed.
Then let me take that one and get back with you if I could.
Thank you. Thank you. Second question, cyber, and I appreciate very much the efforts and the points that you've made in terms of stressing what we're doing, all three secretaries, with respect to cyber. But we as a committee remain deeply concerned about the lack of a cyber strategy from the administration. And we're now 14 months in. We welcome the national security strategy, welcome the national defense strategy, the nuclear posture review. But I would really like to hear from each one of you how you can be confident that you are in fact building the kind of force we need, kind of modern force we need in the absence of an overall cyber operation, cyber deterrent strategy. Secretary Esper.
Congresswoman, we fully recognize the threats that are out there. We are doing everything we can. As I meet with the leads of the cross-functional teams, what I'm reinforcing to them is at their level, making sure that all of our systems are both hardened and resilient. At the same time, as we discussed, I'm looking at how we address cyber on the battlefield to ensure that we are defensively protected and have offensive capabilities. And then, of course, there's the enterprise side of our networks, making sure they are protected as well. So we're doing everything we can within our scope of our authorities and what I have under Title 10 at this point.
Congressman Cheney, it's a challenge. I'll be very honest with you. I'm looking down here. The Navy has $448 million over the fit-up for cybersecurity efforts, everything from hardening HM&E to base hardening. And then we look at the Digital Warfare Office, $27 million in fiscal year 19, going up from there. We are doing what we can, but to be very frank with you, when it comes to the personnel side, we're going to have to be very creative to get the minds that we need to actually attack this and get down to it. We're going to have to come to you probably for some relief on DOPMA. We're going to have on and off tracks. We're going to have different abilities to attract people to get them in and after the problem. But as far as dollars and activity right now, we are focused on protection and primarily and secondarily offensive actions.
I would highlight three things. One is that we're prioritizing. The first is we are charged by Cyber Command with producing 39 cyber mission teams, and we are on track to do that. In fact, I think they've all become fully operational this year. The second is when we look at what are the most important things we need to do, one of them is our network infrastructure is pretty old. We are shifting to enterprise IT as a service so that we move a lot of the kind of enterprise IT, our email and those things, to companies that provide that, and taking our 1,700 cyber people who are in uniform and training them to be more cyber defenders. So we use their skills in a way that's beyond what they serve me in the help desk. The third thing has to do with cyber operational improvements, and the fiscal year 19 budget for the Air Force puts $900 million into more tools and mission defense teams to improve our cyber protection for our bases, but also for our weapons systems.
I thank you all very much for that, and again, I know you're doing the best you can, but I think that it's very difficult to justify the fact that we're now 14 months into this administration, facing the kind of grave threat we face, in particular from Russia and China, and have no official cyber policy. So we'll continue to focus on that as a committee. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Mr. Gates. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Wilson, thank you for coming to my district recently to recognize the valor that was displayed downrange by several of my constituents, and I appreciate the time you spent with me during that visit. You'll recall we discussed the Gulf test range in the eastern Gulf of Mexico and the fact that we currently enjoy military mission line that preserves the eastern Gulf for that test and evaluation mission. As I sit here today, some of my colleagues are taking the position that that line ought to move further east, creating less space for the Air Force and the Navy in particular to engage in the training and testing mission that is so essential. You indicated to me at that time that there was no space between your view and the view that General Goldfein has placed into the record, that the Air Force needs absolutely all of that space going forward for the missions that we have planned and those that we anticipate in the future. Has there been any change in the Air Force's view on that matter?
No.
And can you describe for me some of the consequences, particularly as it relates to munitions testing, if we were to have less space, as some of my colleagues have suggested?
We do testing of missiles off of Eglin, as you well know, but we also do training over the Gulf. And I think, I happen to believe that we should be able to exploit natural resources of the United States for our prosperity, but we also have to maintain our national security. If there are ways in which to do that going forward that allow for both of those things, of course, the Air Force is very open to that. But once we lose the ability to train, particularly in fifth-generation aircraft and hypersonics and other things, it's very hard to get back. So we're very cautious about that.
Has the Air Force reviewed any plan from the Department of the Interior or any other element of the United States federal government that would alter the position of the military mission line that would still preserve the important work that you've described?
I have not personally myself.
Are you aware of anyone within the Air Force that's been presented with such a plan to alter the military mission line?
I don't know, but I can take that question for you.
Thank you. And Secretary Spencer, I'm also aware that the Navy utilizes the Gulf Test Range. Just this last week, I spent time at Boca Chica Field, and they were incredibly proud of the unique assets that the Navy has that maybe would not be able to be used in every setting that's unique to some of the assets we have in the southeastern Gulf. Would a movement of the military mission line concern the Navy?
It would. And I will tell you that professionally, there's no light in between Secretary Wilson and myself on this position.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you all. I would just end related to some discussion y'all had with Mr. Bacon and Mr. Gallagher. At some point this week, we're going to pass, or we're going to finally finish the fiscal year 2018 funding for the military. And we know how much will be spent in 19 because of that budget deal. But it would be a mistake for any of us to leave the impression that this cap agreement and the money that flows from it fixes all our problems. It does not. And I recognize the point. We don't want to give the enemy our playbook and show our vulnerabilities. But on the other hand, as Mr. Gallagher pointed out, we've got to talk frankly to the American people if we're going to have public support for continuing to work to finish our problems. And a lot of that responsibility falls on each of you for your respective services. So I just want to emphasize, we've got to manage expectations a little bit here. Not everything is fixed because we have a substantial increase in 1 year. The problems run deep. And the closer you, I see it, the closer you look, the deeper the problems are. And it's really important for each of y'all to talk frankly about those problems and about what it takes to fix them. And Ms. Secretary Spencer, I think your SHIP plan helps highlight that. I didn't really know what was going on. I appreciate your explanations today. I think that shows the difference between what we say and what we're actually doing, and I think that's a useful thing. Ms. Murphy, coming in late, do you have a scintillating question that is just going to change the world?
I'm not sure that my question will change the world, Mr. Chairman, but I do want to get it in for the record, if that'd be okay.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. First, I want to thank you all for appearing before the committee today, and I also want to thank the chairman and ranking member for holding this hearing on such an important issue. I wholeheartedly agree that the department's traditional acquisitions process is too slow and cumbersome, especially given the life cycle of tech today. Secretary Esper, I appreciated the opportunity to meet with you recently, and I know that the Army is currently evaluating potential locations for its new Futures Command. Can you elaborate on the search process and highlight a few of the qualities that you feel are essential for this new headquarters?
Yes, Congresswoman. The task force that is actually has developed courses of action for Futures Command, and that has completed that task. They are now developing a set of criteria upon which we would consider locations for the actual Futures Command. So that will be coming to me sometime in the next week or two for approval, and then beyond that point, we'll start putting locations through that filter and seeing how things come out. There will be a number of factors, I think one of which, of course, will be easy access, quick access to very good civilian talent, so we could leverage those types of folks from academia, from industry, whatever the case may be, in terms of either thinking about the future or thinking about materiel solutions that we need down the road.
Thank you. And, as you may know, I represent a district known for its growing prominence in the high-tech clusters of innovation, such as modeling and simulation, as well as world-class educational opportunities, the very things that you're talking about as far as a civilian workforce that's talented, hooked in with the second-largest research and development university in the country. I think that it's critical that the Army's Future Command is located in such a center of excellence to capitalize on the existing academic, business, and workforce infrastructure. So thank you, and I'll yield back.
I thank you, gentlelady. It's an important topic. Thank you all for being here, for answering our questions, and for our chance to work together in the future. The hearing stands adjourned.
Handing me my yeah.
I know. Exactly. How are you?
Thank you, bud. Yeah, likewise.
Sorry to I just yeah, apparently it's snowed in.
I'll worry about it. We'll still keep in mind and no doubt.
So in the next couple of weeks,
I think they're going to bring me their price criteria. The pretty close to the.
I think it does. I mean, there's going to be a few differences. You know, some of them are related to the passage of time. Some of them the appropriators just get wrong.
We'll probably come back around.
Well, so we sent you a letter last week.
Yes, but I think it's kind of up to them.
Do you sense that this, you know, you were in the conference when they talked about this. Do you sense that this is a thing that is going to be at least so many Democrats to come over because there's talk about these other issues, as you say?
Don't make the decision on
I mentioned a conference last night, and any big bill like this, there's good, and there's bad, and there's ugly. The good weighs very heavily in this bill, as we were just talking about today, with the absolute necessity of beginning to repair our military. So I think Republicans, Democrats, lots of folks can swallow some things they're not so fond of in order to get our military back to state.
Assessment on progress for the NDAA?
Hey, we're pressing right along. You heard lots of questions today about some specifics on programs that members were interested in. So, yeah, I think we'll be certainly on schedule, not only for committee, but the floor before Memorial.
It was no more back and forth.
We're not resuming, we're just not stopping.
Thank you.
Well, I think it's very important to continue to exercise with our close allies facing a very aggressive threat. And it is important to continue those exercises. It improves both our militaries, and it also makes a message that we will not be back. This is a good time. Of course, they're making all sorts of plans for all sorts of things, and they should. There ought to be plans for all sorts of contingencies. Absolutely. That's what we count on these guys to do. So that's a good thing.
You mentioned the Air Force's memo there at the end, and I know you discussed the kind of balance of making the case to the public, but also not providing too much information. At what point does the DoD's media policy become a headache for you? Are we at that point yet, or are we getting close?
That's exactly what we're I do think there's a balance. We've talked about it before. I've talked with Secretary Mattis about it before. Public support is essential for the support of our military. And transparency is an important feature of our system. We don't want to be dumb about it and give adversaries a leg up on us by disclosing things we shouldn't. And there's always a tension back and forth. But I think more open discussion is generally better. It has generally better results.
Do you have any concerns about the way the Air Force went about this reset?
Well, I thought Secretary Wilson made a good point. Nobody noticed until the memo came. I've just heard her say it. Yeah, I have concerns about because as I understand, they kind of suspended everything with their public affairs officers for a period of retraining. The world does not wait for us to retrain. It's true in any specialty. So I do have some concerns about that. But that's part of the reason, fairly unique to our system, we have an independent branch of government that oversees what they do and how they do it. And I think the results of that and the results of public disclosure that comes from having hearings like today is a good thing for our system. So we'll keep trying to do our part. All right. Have you run? Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
A lot of cheating going on.